We are live. I'll sit back for a minute and talk before we start testing. So, it's Jared Walton, Tom's Hardware, our GPU guy. This is the RTX 5090 Founders Edition. We did an unboxing video. We are allowed to show it. What we are not allowed to show is powering it on or disassembling it or benchmarks. Basically, anything that NVIDIA hasn't revealed. You can look at their benchmarks, which compare RTX 5090 mostly with DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, MFG, to 4090 with frame generation. There is one comparison point where they showed, what is it? A Plague Tale Requiem, I think, with DLSS 3 frame generation maybe on both. And then there was another one, Far Cry 6 or something, where it's no frame generation. The expectation based on specs, this has about 27% more compute than a 4090, and it has about 80% more memory bandwidth than a 4090. So if you're fully GPU limited and other architectural differences don't come into play, you would expect this to be up to maybe 27% faster. If it's memory bandwidth limited, it could actually be a lot faster than that. If you're CPU limited, which is going to be the case in a lot of stuff that we test, and not just we test, I test, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be CPU limited in tons of games, just because there's no CPU fast enough. If we had an infinitely fast CPU, maybe we could get higher utilization of the 5090 and 4090. So I've run 4090 numbers, I've run 5090 numbers, and emailed NVIDIA about them. And I'm now testing the 4080 Super, which you can see in the test bed. I'll bring the camera closer and get to benchmarking. Screen is not that visible from this distance because of white balancing and such. That'll change, hopefully. You can let me know in the comments. If you're watching this and you want to ask a question, fire away. I will periodically look at my screen over there to check and see if there's questions people want to talk about. But the 5090, it's lighter than the 4090, not surprisingly. I mean, it's actually, where's my 4090? I should show this. This is kind of cool. They're both heavy. Okay, that is the 4090 on top of the 5090. Is one of them backward? No, they're the same way. And the actual dimensions, length and width, are, I mean, if not identical, it's within like millimeter or two. So the only real change is the thickness, and of course the industrial design is completely different. And you've got the dual flow through fan on the 5090. And yeah, that's about it. My old beat up Secret Labs chair that I haven't gotten rid of. It's falling apart. Well, the pleather is coming off. So 5090 goes on sale January 30th. $2,000, $1,999.99. I still don't understand why we just don't say $2,000, but whatever. Marketing. My expectation, if you're wondering, is that this is going to sell out, and it's probably going to sell out for a while, because there are rich gamers who will want one for sure. But there are also AI people that will want one, and they'll be willing to pay a lot more than $2,000. Like people doing AI work on an RTX 6000 Ada, for example. Okay, yes, that has 48 gigabytes of memory. This only has 32. But 32 is more than 24. Faster memory, faster compute, FP4 native support, which can help in certain workloads. The only other thing right now with FP4 native support, I think, is the full-blown Blackwell B200 stuff that you also, I don't know that you're actually able to get those. Maybe they're shipping, maybe they're out there that you can lease them or whatever in the cloud. but that's kind of a big deal. So you could write code on a 5090, test it using CUDA, and be ready for the Blackwell B200 in theory. I'm sure there will be bugging required and all that stuff. Let's not worry about that. Man, you know what I should have done? I should have installed NVIDIA Broadcast on this computer. Actually, I can't. So there's a new broadcast version coming out that will have like auto lighting and better audio fixing, so noise removal, but it also has a studio mic feature, which I like. This is just using a Logitech Brio and its integrated microphone, so I have no idea how bad it sounds. Yell at me if it sounds really bad in the chat, but I'm trying to talk as loud as I'm comfortable doing for what could be. I'm not going to do the whole benchmarking session, because once I start benchmarking the 4080 Super, if I did nothing else, it would be a solid 10 hours or so. There are things that run in the background, like I do spec workstation 4.0. That takes maybe an hour to run, and that's not even the full suite, but I do run that, and I don't have to sit there and babysit it. But I'm not going to be on stream doing that, because that would be really boring. Hey, look, here's spec running. And again, 5090, I can show the card, I can talk about the card, I can't talk about performance. You can ask questions related to architecture. I wrote a bunch of articles on it, and NVIDIA has revealed a bunch of stuff. The white paper's out there. We know full specs. We know a lot about the card. We just don't have the final independent performance benchmarks. So let's talk about that for a minute while I get going here. Let's see. What can we do with my camera? I don't know if you can read that on the screen. NVIDIA drivers 571.86. These are the preview drivers for Blackwell. I don't know that they contain any optimizations for the 40 series. There could actually be regressions if there's bugs. I don't know. I've got Riva Tuner statistics server that I'll leave running in the corner. Minimal overhead. I'll also have PCAT running. That's to show real-time power use. I don't need to see it, but what I need is for it to capture power use with my frame view testing. So here's NVIDIA Frame View. This is also a version that's been updated with support for multi-frame generation DLSS 4 stuff, which I'm not testing right now. I'm not testing for the initial review due to time constraints. What I will test is a bunch of games. So just ignore that PC Gamer business. I used to work for them. They're owned by the same company. So games I'm testing: Baldur's Gate 3, Black Myth Wukong, Control Ultimate, Dragon Age, The Veilguard, F124, Horizon Forbidden West. I may test Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I'm not sure if I'll get that into this review. Flight Simulator, both the 2020 release and the 2024 release, just because the 2024 is new enough that people might be like, hey, I'm still playing 2020. A Plague Tale Requiem, Stalker 2, and Starfield. We'll start with the Steam stuff. We've also got the Epic Games library. Hey, why is it showing? There we go. So in the Epic library, I've got Final Fantasy 16, God of War Ragnarok, Hogwarts Legacy, Marvel, Spider-Man, Miles Morales. I'm not going to test MechWarrior 5 Clans. The Last of Us Part 1, Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2. I'm not going to test Witchfire. It's just something I was playing, not testing. And then there's also Cyberpunk 2077. And from Ubisoft, I have Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Avatar Frontiers of Pandora and Star Wars Outlaws. So there should be 22 games total. Oh, I'm missing, and Minecraft. Minecraft is in the list. So Some of the games require you to change the desktop resolution in order to get proper support. Let's go ahead and start with Minecraft just because that's easy enough and I can adjust audio and things. I want this to be on my USB speakers and I want its volume to be low. All right. And then, so Minecraft runs at your desktop resolution. So I've got to set that to 1080p and then we'll launch. And if you're looking up in the corner, frame rate, 1600 at the menu, because there's no, I've disabled the frame rate cap. And I'm using the Portal Pioneers benchmark level. So it's an experience level and you can, it is actually kind of a canned benchmark. That's nice. Got to check settings. So video, we have ray tracing enabled, upscaling is off, render distance of 8 chunks. All of these are enabled. I'm not sure if they're supposed to be. I thought clouds or skies or something might affect ray tracing in the past, but it is what it is now. That's how it's been tested on the other cards I've done. Might need to change it. Interestingly, frame view is not showing up in the top right corner. Dual overlays maybe. Am I running frame view? All right. While this runs, I'm going to go check over on the feed and tell people that we're live, and you can ask questions if you want. I'm still here. Let's see. One run done. Okay, that looks... Oh, I know why. Minecraft has this weird bug that started appearing. Oh, that's not the weird bug. That's a different weird bug. Something just went screwy when I alt-tabbed. So I gotta save and exit. Benchmarking, it's so fun. So Minecraft has this weird thing right now. Let's just exit Steam, where it loses your audio device. See, that's still messed up. What's going on? Gosh. Stupid Minecraft. That shouldn't do that. It doesn't normally do that. It's like it's gotten into a bad state. Which means let's just restart. It's not supposed to do that, people. Goodness, that's off to an amazing, amazing beginning. And if you're wondering, like, why am I doing a live stream from a different computer showing the screen like this? The answer is I'm going to be running these benchmarks regardless. So you can see the process. And I don't want to interfere with performance at all. So if I were trying to stream directly from the computer that's being tested, that can drop performance 5 to 10%, maybe even more. So I'm doing it as a separate stream on a different PC. Yes, this is totally janky in some regards, but that's all right. Janky is good. I'm a PC enthusiast. I'm not a live streamer. All right, we're back. Actually, let's make sure audio is working. Okay, I heard that. Nothing should have changed. There we go. It's making a little bit of noise. You probably can't hear it, but I can. And what's important is I can hear the start and stop of frame view. All right, Minecraft running properly now. While that runs, I'm sharing my live stream on my Facebook, so. All right. Someone send me a message. If you're watching, send a message so that I can verify I can see messages. Because I don't see any messages so far, and I'm like, either the 6 people on are quiet, or they're all bots. I don't know. Share this with your friends if you're on, if they'd be interested in computer talk. Again, I'm not just going to ramble and talk about everything and anything. There might be some pregnant pauses and silences, creaks from my chair. But if you've got a question that I can answer, I will try to do so. Silence. Also, what's this frame rate coming at on YouTube? I'm going to go log in on a different PC. Let's see. Sorry, that got quiet. Hello. Okay, that's my delay. A couple seconds. All right, I can test. I'm here. We're live. Now it's time to start the benchmarks. Minecraft, first on the list. So the first run gets tossed. That's my way of testing. because the GPU and PC and everything is potentially cooler running. Maybe assets need to get loaded. So the first run doesn't count. Second and third runs, I take the best run of those two, and that's the score that I use in the charts. If there's a major discrepancy, then I might run a third and fourth test as well. Hopefully, we don't get that much. 4080 Super is old enough that the results should be pretty straightforward. See, do you like it like this, where you can see the test bed and the 5090? Oh man, that's still a heavy card. I think it weighs just over 4 pounds. I know I need better lighting in here. This is my work office. It's my workspace. I'm not a live streamer normally, but we thought this would be fun because I need to test as many GPUs as I can in the next whatever. How many days is it until the 30th? 9 days until launch. And if you know NVIDIA, you also know that Founders Edition reviews can usually go up the day before launch, and then partner cards the day of launch. So I've turned the RT chunks render distance to maximum of 24. This is my ultra settings for Minecraft. We dropped from maybe 210 FPS down to 200 FPS, at least when standing still. But once you start moving, the frame rates change a lot more. Someone with YouTube knowledge, is there a way to see people who are in the stream? I mean, like, I can see that there's a handful of people logged in. One of them is me. But I can't see the names. Is that normal? Probably is, right? YouTube Live. I have not really done YouTube Live. One run is complete of 1080p Ultra. This is like the easiest test because I don't need to control it the whole time. It's still a level. Maybe user input would change performance somewhat. Different maps change performance. Minecraft RTX version it's kind of old at this point. I mean, it came out in 2020, was it? For the 30 series? I believe that's when it first came out publicly. Maybe it was even 2021. Looks very different from vanilla Minecraft, but there are a bunch of Minecraft mods that you can get to change the way the game looks. If you're running regular Minecraft like Java Edition, I don't know how demanding those are. I don't think any of them use the ray tracing hardware that modern GPUs have. And I don't usually test mods as such because that just is a huge can of worms. They're usually not performance tested and evaluated to make sure that things are optimized well. You can't depend on NVIDIA and AMD to go out and be like, hey, we're going to optimize for mod XYZ. So I've got to change the resolution at the desktop to 1440p. That's reflected up here. Performance, you can see, took a big hit. We were at like around 200 before. Now we're sitting at 120. That's pretty much as expected. What game would you like me to test next? Of the games I listed, so there's 22 games total. Sound off in the chat. Which one do you want to see next? Don't say Black Myth Wukong. I mean, you can. But Black Myth Wukong is a 140-second benchmark per run. So I wasn't planning on live streaming that because it will take a long time. It will take about 10 runs. So about 25 minutes just to get through Black Myth Wukong. And it's not one that I control live. So, because that one has a built-in benchmark, and because all the enemies respawn every time, it's harder to do like running around the test environment. So I just use the built-in benchmark as a proxy. The other ones that have a built-in benchmark, F124 has races. You can specify the racetrack and the weather. And so I use that on the Great Britain map. And Flight Simulator, both of those. It's not a built-in benchmark, but I just use one of the test challenges, the activities, and I set the plane in motion. It's basically going to crash, but I let it fly down until it almost crashes, and that's my benchmark sequence for those. Everything else this year is pretty much a manual run using frame view to capture performance data. So it captures frame times, it captures power use, captures GPU clock speeds and temperatures, CPU clock speeds and temperatures, GPU utilization, all of that stuff, which is beneficial for me. I think all that data is useful. Hey, there's some chats. Let's see what people are saying. Thanks, Tim. Tim Balam is not a lurker. Thanks, Tim, for not lurking. What's a good CPU for an RX 5700 XT and a B550 motherboard? So that's AM4. These days, if you're running AM4 and you're trying to find a good CPU for it, I mean, I would think you already have a CPU, but if you're maybe running an earlier generation CPU and you want an upgrade, the best CPU for socket AM4 is going to be the Ryzen 7 5800X3D. I think there's also a 5700X3D that maybe isn't as available anymore. I'm not sure either one of them is widely available these days because they've been out a while and production has probably stopped on them. So what's there is there, and it will sell out eventually. But 5700 XT is going to be roughly at the level of, let's see, I want to say 2070 Super. And the 2070 Super is probably maybe the level of a 4060. So you're not really going to be CPU limited with a 5700 XT. Obviously, you can't run ray tracing games. There are games that simply won't work on a 5700 XT now. Not many. You'll have to set the graphics settings down as well. Okay, that takes care of 1440p. Last test for Minecraft, we've got to go to 4K. See, that was weird where I got those spikes that one time. I saw that happen once before, and I don't know what caused it, but games do weird things sometimes when you Alt-Tab, even if they're borderless window mode. Yeah, so Ryzen 3700X, so that's the Zen. Gosh, I gotta get my numbers right. That's Zen 2. So Zen 3 would be a modest upgrade, but the Zen 3 X3D chips, for gaming especially, are a big upgrade. That 64 megabytes of extra L3 cache really does help out a lot. I would say a 5800 X3D, 5700 X3D, if you could find one, depending on what resolution you were running. Like if you're running at 4K, you could probably go all the way up to 4080 Super and only lose a very small amount of performance relative to the 9800 X3D that I'm running here. Long term, you know, if you're upgrading your CPU to that, I think you would be good up through the 40 series or a lower tier 50 series part, or probably AMD's upcoming RDNA 4. RDNA 4, we don't know where it's going to land exactly. I kind of suspect it will be going up against the 5070 and 5070 Ti. So anything above that level, AMD is not really going to try and beat this year. I don't know if it will be like Polaris and Vega, where you had Polaris launch in, I can't remember, 2015, 2017, no, 20, let's see, Pascal came out in 2016. Did Polaris come out the same year? I think it did, right? And then the Vega chips came out the next year in 2017. So will we get like a higher performance, either RDNA 4 or RDNA 4.5 or something from AMD next year? Will they do a giant RDNA 4 chip sooner than that? All indications right now are they're only going up to the mainstream level, like I would think $500-ish graphics cards for AMD. We'll find out, but yeah, I think a 5800 X3D would be good up through that performance level. All right, that takes care of Minecraft. So change my settings back to the way they were. Save and quit. All right, and so this is my performance results for the card that I just tested. You probably can't read that. I can. And then here's all my benchmarks. And yes, there are 5090 results in there, but you won't be able to see those. So then I go through and I pick out the better results from the list. Name the files, and we're done. All right, checking chat. Okay. I'll answer Sarah's question. No one's got a game request. Okay, we're gonna go with Steam then. We'll go with Steam, and we'll do Baldur's Gate is the next in the list. Everyone's like, hey, can we see your username now? Woo. I don't know why anyone would care. Sarah asked, oh, we got multiple questions. What are the chances of a good deal on a 40 series GPU now that the 50 series comes out? And the answer is, like, if you're buying brand new, I don't think you'll see any good deals. If you're buying used, you could probably find people selling off their old 40 series to get a 50 series. I don't know how cheap they're going to go. I mean, 4090s, I don't think are going to come down that much in price because people like the speed and the memory and all that. Based on what we know from the 5090 presentations NVIDIA has given, like the up to roughly 27% faster, the 5090 is basically the same performance per dollar as the 4090 at $1,600. So like if you're looking at a 4090 at $1,600 and a 5090 at $2,000, you're not really getting a better deal by buying the new card. That changes as you go down to like the 5080, because you've got the 5080 at $1,000, the 4080 Super at $1,000. The 5080 should be 10 to 20% faster at the same price. So that makes it a better card for the dollar. Will you see 4080 Super selling for like $700? Probably on eBay or places like that. I don't think you'll see them on Newegg and Amazon. And as always, be cautious of scams and such. I tend to prefer, oh, I got it. No, I got my settings right. Okay. So Baldur's Gate 3, this is my test sequence. Zoomed out, turn off the interface, and start running right there. Then we do a little loop. And it varies because people move around, but it seems like it doesn't vary a lot. There's maybe like a 1 FPS difference between runs. So 40 series, I think there will be some people getting rid of cards that are used for a discount. I think the brand new cards will largely be sold through retail channels or are sold already. Like 4090 and 4080 Super and 4080, those are all basically gone as far as I can tell. No one's releasing new cards at reasonable prices for those. They've all been sold out. In fact, I still feel like NVIDIA was originally maybe intending to launch the Blackwell 50 series cards in the fall. That would have been their pattern, but there were packaging issues with the data center Blackwell parts. And because of those packaging issues, we don't know how many wafers and chips were lost, but potentially a lot. And you only get, I think, 60-ish B200 chips per wafer, and you need 2 of those chips per GPU. And so if you lose tens of thousands of chips, that's a lot of wafers that you've just lost. And then when they're selling for $100,000 per GPU or whatever NVIDIA charges, it's a lot for the data center stuff. Their margins are going to be way better than the margins on the consumer 50 series. So they've created the 50 series. It's not like there aren't cards at all, but I don't know how many wafers were ordered of the GB202 that goes in the 5090 versus the GB203 that's in the 5080 and 5070 Ti versus the lower tier parts. But again, if you're NVIDIA and you've basically sold your entire allocation for the Blackwell B200 data center stuff for all of 2025, that means if you can make more of those, you can sell more of those. People will want to jump the queue or just get their parts earlier than expected. So do you make more RTX 5090s or do you make more Blackwell B200s for the data center? And the business decision would definitely be to make the data center parts. So we could see limited quantities of 5090, 5080 throughout the year, as far as I'm concerned. As you go down the product stack, I think the new cards become less enticing. So the 5090 is clearly better than the 4090. It has 33% more memory. It has 80% more memory bandwidth. It has, notice that DLSS and FSR are off. 50% or 80% more memory bandwidth, and it's got FP4 support. So those are all reasons that the 5090 is better, and particularly better for, is that really as detailed as it gets? Those rocks look like they didn't load a texture. Now you got me wondering. Oh, it's because I hit the wrong preset. I was going to say, that looks really crappy. That's better. Okay. What was I saying? Oh, if you look at like the 5080 versus the 4080 Super, it's incrementally faster, I think. That's my expectation. And when NVIDIA says, oh, the 5070 is going to be as fast as a 4090, like, let's be frank, that's a load of marketing crap. It depends on multi-frame generation, and multi-frame generation, like frame generation, it's not the same as actually rendered frames because there's no new user input. It's frame smoothing. It might be really good frame smoothing, but with multi-frame generation, a game running at, say, 240 frames per second is only sampling the user input at 60 frames per second. So it looks as smooth as 240 FPS, maybe. And in some sense, that tricks your brain a little bit so that it maybe feels a bit smoother. There are games where DLSS 3 frame generation, like it, to me, can feel a little bit better than native at times. So like if you're doing say 90 frames per second with frame generation versus 60 frames per second without. So you got a 50% increase in quote unquote performance. Does it actually feel 50% faster? No, not really, because your user input is now sampling at 45 frames per second instead of 60 frames per second. So it looks smoother, samples slower, and depending on the game and the game engine, it can feel better or worse. It can look good, but it's important to recognize that frame generation is not rendered frames. And so when Jensen goes on and on about how, hey, we're now rendering 2 pixels for every 32 that we generate and show to the user, I'm like, well, yes, that is technically what they are doing with AI, but the experience is not the same as rendering 32 pixels. It simply just isn't. And anyone who's played with frame generation and played games knows that's true. So with frame generation, often you would get maybe a 50% boost in performance relative to native rendering or relative to not frame generation. Whether you're using DLSS upscaling or not is a different story. With multi-frame generation, like you're generating twice as many frames, but I don't think you're generating them in the same amount of time as you generate a single frame. So it's not like, hey, I was getting frame gen with 100 FPS, and now with multi-frame gen, I get 200 FPS. NVIDIA's own numbers didn't show that. And I haven't run multi-frame generation tests, so I have no personal data that I'm sharing here. So based off of NVIDIA's numbers, it looked like anywhere from a 40% to, there was one game where it showed more than a 100% improvement, which shouldn't be possible. So I don't know what that was about. But if it's not double the frame rate of the regular frame gen performance, then you'll actually sample user input even slower than with DLSS 3 frame generation. So the twice as fast thing via MFG is really, really deceptive in my opinion. It's very much marketing, and I'm calling them out, and others will call them out, I'm sure. I'm not saying it's bad universally, that no one should want it, but MFG at, say, 120 frames per second means that it's actually sampling the user at only 30 frames per second. And I know what 30 frames per second games feel like. And so if it feels like a 30 frames per second game, but looks like it's running at 120 frames per second, like, yes, the 120 would be better than a 30 native, but the 120 definitely wouldn't be better than 60 native. You would have much better responsiveness and control and the ability to aim. So like NVIDIA at their CES stuff, they had some games running. One was on a 4090 and one was on a 5090. So you had frame gen versus MFG. And I think, was it Valorant? It was something like that. And they were showing how the 5090 was almost twice as fast. It was like running at 250 frames per second compared to 125, or maybe it's 300 compared to 150, or whatever it was. But the thing is when you're getting that high of frame rates, that's not really the problem. Where you really want the improvement in frame rates is where you're like, hey, I'm only getting like 40 frames per second, and I would like to be getting 80 or 90. And with upscaling, you could maybe get that. With frame generation, you get fake frames that might be 60 to 90, depending on the game and other stuff. And so that doesn't feel nearly as good. How's that for a lot of rambling? I'm almost done with Baldur's Gate 3. I'm going to skip Black Myth Wukong built-in benchmark because that takes so long. That's a good one for when I need to go write stuff and do other work, edit news stories, things of that nature, because I can get little chunks of 2 minutes at a time while I'm doing the Black Myth Wukong benchmark. By the way, the display I'm using, if you want to know, it is an MSI OLED screen. It's 4K, 240 hertz, DisplayPort 2.1 capable. So it's the MPG 272 UX OLED. Really nice display. Really like it. Not paid to say that by MSI or anything, but like if you're looking at a 5090 or even a 4090, this is the kind of display that you should be running. If you have a 4K 60 display or even maybe 4K 144 hertz, I'm not sure you're going to get everything you would want to out of a 5090. Like with MFG, you could easily break 144 frames per second and still not have an amazing experience. And that's frames per second in quotes because you're quadrupling the base frame rate. So, 160 frames per second is 40 base. Yeah. Performance. Baldur's Gate 3. I did run some of those tests more than I normally do just because I was distracted. Let's see. So if you look at the power column, you can tell where I've changed resolutions. So like this is 4K. Are these all? No. So these two are 1440p. Usually Baldur's Gate, you get a slow run on the first time, and then your second run is the good run. Second and subsequent runs are better. I've discovered that through trial and error, if you want to call it that. Yes, I just delete the files that I didn't use. So if I do, this is a little script I wrote using the lovely language of Gawk, G-A-W-K. Yeah, okay. So look at this. This is the 4080 Supers up here, 4090s here. And at 1080p medium, they're almost tied. Also basically tied at 1080p Ultra and 1440p Ultra. The 4090 is just barely faster. But it's only at 4K Ultra where the 4090 pulls ahead by, I don't know, 30% maybe. So without testing or looking at the numbers, if the 5090 follows this pattern, we're CPU limited to around 175 frames per second. So if it's up to 27% faster than a 4090, well, it won't be that in Baldur's Gate 3 because it will run into the CPU limit of around 175, even at 4K. So then it's like, well, DLSS upscaling isn't necessary. I don't think frame generation is supported in Baldur's Gate 3. So what are you going to do? Well, if you're playing Baldur's Gate 3, probably not do a big upgrade. This is a shorter benchmark sequence for Control Ultimate Edition. I'm going to go check my chat over here and see what you guys are saying. Hopefully that looks better once the screen shows stuff, because right now it's really blown out. There we go. All right, Control Ultimate Edition, not that that matters. This one's pretty short. I used to do a different test sequence, but basically you'd have to do a battle every third benchmark run, and so it took more time. And it's an old game, so this is one of the few games where all the ray tracing stuff makes difference. So this is with ray tracing. We'll start at 1080p medium. 1080p medium in Control actually runs into, yeah, so 240 FPS. That is a game limit, hard-coded into the game as far as I can tell. I can't find a way to disable it. And what it does is the 1% lows actually start being impacted because it's trying to cap it at 240 frames per second and it screws up. So it's kind of annoying. The 1080p medium numbers aren't really meaningful for cards like the 4080 Super and 4090 and 5090. They'll all hit 240 FPS, and their minimums will look different because of the faster the card is, the worse the minimums get, is what it amounts to. So I make some explosions in the game. I throw stuff around, and that's my loop. Is that a bad benchmark? I don't know. Yeah, so look at that. 127 frames per second on the 1% lows, 235 on the average FPS. And that's because of the 240 FPS frame rate cap. Also because that was the first run. So the first run in Control very much gets a lot of fluctuations as it loads assets. So 235 and 127, we do the second run, and what do we get? And if you look at these numbers and you go and look at the review whenever that goes live, and you go, hey, those aren't the same numbers that we saw in your benchmark sequence. Well, what frame view reports and how I calculate things aren't identical. I'm not quite sure what all the differences are, and I probably will retest some things as well. Okay, that looks better. 235 and 159. I want to say that the 4090 1% lows at 1080p medium were like 120 or something, and that was because it could run at, say, maybe 300 something frames per second, but the forced bottleneck of 240, it tries to balance that out, and it ends up causing this line here gets a lot more wobbly on a 4090. And if memory serves, I think it was even worse on the 5090. This is why frame rate caps suck. So I run these benchmarks at 1080p just because I've got the GPU benchmarks hierarchy, and it's useful to show, like, hey, if you're only running 1080p, you don't need a 5090 or a 4090 or a 4080 Super or whatever. Like, upgrade your monitor and your resolution before you worry about the top of the line graphics card. If you're running 1440p, even the 4090 and the 4080 Super aren't that far apart. If you're running 4K, that's where the 30% gap, sometimes more, comes into play. I think at high settings on everything, there's no ultra, so you can't go higher, but high settings will now drop well below the 240 FPS cap, if I remember right. And so now the frame times, the minimum frame rates, look a lot more consistent. Ask a good question, somebody. I can talk. Probably need to get up and go take a little walk break for 5 minutes as well. It's not good to sit around when you're 50 years old and benchmark games all day. Did you know that? Shocking health advice. 159 and 137. So you see how close those are? There's only a 22 FPS gap between 159 and 137. And that's because we're well below that 244 limit, or 240 FPS limit now. While I'm benchmarking Control, shout out to AMD for having screwed up drivers or something for Control. They used to be better. I don't know what happened. Intel's drivers are doing okay. AMD's drivers in Control, especially on cards with like 8 gigabytes of VRAM, they're just, you'll get like okay performance for the first run or the first 30 seconds or so, and then all of a sudden performance just drops off a cliff. And I've said it before in reviews, I think, but I'll say it again. Yeah, that's my timer. It says I need to go take a walk. So I'll finish Control, and then I'll take a little break, leave the stream running, come back in a minute, and you guys can throw up and chat what you want to see benchmark next. But yeah, AMD's 8 gigabyte cards, and even I think the 12 gigabyte to a lesser extent. They have problems with control now where you can't run the same test sequence like 5 times and get basically the same score every time. And it's funny because this is a 2019 game. Like, it should be totally well-known, optimized for whatever. And I have results from 2 years ago where performance was markedly better than what I now get on things like the RX 6650 XT or whatever. Down to only 100 frames per second, 99 frames per second at 1440p, 87 minimums. So the gap between average and 1% low is only like 12%, 13%. That's when the game is running consistently. And if I were doing a longer benchmark sequence, running around the world more, you know, it depends on where you go, what the level is like, how complex it is. Like, no benchmark can capture everything. So even though this is a short sequence, I've tested it enough and I was like, nope, the results were the same as my older 60-second sequence and I don't have to battle any of the hiss. And so let's make my benchmarking life easier by not requiring twice as much effort and time. 98.87. So 1 FPS lower on the average. So pretty consistent. And then our final run at 4K. And this sequence that I'm running actually doesn't have as much of the ray tracing excitement that you might see. There's a bunch of mirrored windows and stuff in the office spaces that if you're running around throughout the Federal Bureau of Control, those reflections actually look really nice. You don't see those so much here, but rest assured there are ray tracing calculations happening. I have tested different areas of the game, and this little sequence I'm doing with the explosions ended up being more demanding than some of those highly reflective mirrored hallways. So I'm not saying you can't find an area of the game that's more demanding. I'm sure you can. I'm just saying, like, you have to pick and choose your battles, and at some point you just need to find something that's easy to test and go with it rather than like playing through the whole game on every GPU. I averaged X frames per second with minimums of Y while playing for 40 hours straight. Next game. Who would watch that? I wouldn't. Who's watching this? This is a trial. We're curious to see if anyone will be excited by this. I know what you really want to see is the 5090 benchmarks, and you know, I wish we could show that. All I can show is the 5090 card sitting there taunting you. But I will have partner cards for the 5090. So if there's excitement enough about this live stream business, me benchmarking live, which has been going for, gosh, how long, guys? An hour? 40 minutes? Something? If you like this and you want to see live benchmarking of the 5090 after the embargo is done, you know, let us know and we can try and do that. So I've got the 5090, 4090, 4080 Super. I want to test the 3090, and I need to test AMD's 7900 XTX. And then, like, there's a bunch of other cards I would like to test, like, you know, 4070 Ti Super. 4080 and 4080 Super are so close that there's no real point in testing both of them initially. That's like for the GPU hierarchy down the road. I will retest the 4080, even if it's only 2% slower than the 4080 Super. But yeah. Then I also look at the performance, and so example here, we got 159.9 with 130 frames per second minimums, and then 159.5, so 0.4 frames per second lower, but 134 almost frames per second on the 1% lows. And so I usually will take, because that's like 3% difference on the 1% lows and only a 0.3% difference on the average. I will usually keep the more consistent frame rate as my final result. I think it's a better result overall. And I don't think that like 0.4 frames per second difference in standings really matters. So if we do control is done. All right, I'm going to take a break for, call it 5 minutes. I'll be back. I'll look at your chat. What do you want to run next? We'll leave that there. Epic will leave running here. Choose a game. I might be less than 5 minutes, but let me know what you think. Is there a pause button on the live stream? That's what I need. I've not been live streaming enough. You want the library. Which of those games do you want to see benchmarked next? Let me know in the chat. Thanks, Sarah. So, Ma, this is all testing with DDR5 6000. It's G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo DDR5 6000 CL30. That is what I started with. I do actually have some CL28 memory, which would be a little bit faster, but then I'd have to retest everything. So because I've started, I'm going to stick with that. Back in a jiffy. Isn't that a great benchmark setup? It looks super janky, but the reason is there's a PCAT device underneath here that's for measuring power. My old PCAT alternative, so this is the not PCAT. That's my old 9900K test bed. So this janky thing here was Pownetics, and there's also a card that goes with it that's not hooked up right now. So this card was to slot between the GPU and the system and get power measurements. And so NVIDIA's PCAT actually generates the same basic results, but looks a little better, is a little more reliable, and ties into frame view so that I can capture power on every benchmark that I run. Whereas with that Pownetics thing, I had to run a separate process. Yeah. Yep, we do all the same systems. So that's the current new system with the 9800X 3D. That's the old system with the 13900K. There's a few graphics cards next to it. That's not all of the current generation, I don't think, but it's most of the current, meaning 40 series and 7000 series and ARC. So ARC B570 is over in that test bed. Okay, really going to walk away. Back in 5. I gotta fix my camera. I'm back. All right, chat, did you have any suggestions? Solid AI video generator. Oh, I need a good, so that's from Video Cruiser. I need a good AI video generator that even works on consumer GPUs. Like a lot of the best AI video stuff that I've heard of really needs the crazy like H200 configurations where you've got lots of GPUs and are able to use 800 gigabytes of memory or whatever. If anyone has a recommendation for something that works on multiple GPU types, like it needs to support, I'll come into the frame. Woo. So if I were doing video generation on GPUs, like Stable Diffusion images, right? But for video, I would ideally want something that I can run on NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel GPUs. And that's hard to find right now. And I know there's things that I've seen where it's like, hey, on a 4090, you can generate 4 seconds of, I don't even think it's 720p video. I don't know if that's improved, but if anyone has any suggestions on a video generator that will work on things like a 4090 or even a 4080 Super, and of course, hopefully work on the 5090 as well and work on AMD's 7900 XTX, 7900 XT, let me know. Sound off in the comments. Fire me off an email, jared.walton@futurenet.com. There's my public email. No, it got leaked as part of E3 a few years ago, so I get so much spam anyway, it mostly gets filtered. All right. So the 5090's 3400 tops is interesting because in my mind, tops means tera operations, trillions of operations. And then there's T-flops, which is trillions of floating point operations. And those aren't the same thing normally, but AI is weird. So initially AI, they started doing it with FP32, then they migrated to FP16. They said, we can get the same quality with FP16 as we can with FP32, but with twice the compute, basically. And then they did more research and they started doing things with 8-bit integers, and NVIDIA created FP8, 8-bit floating point, which at that point I'm like, is that really even floating point anymore? I mean, it can be, right? But it's just weird that, like, what does 8-bit floating point give you that 8-bit integer doesn't? And it's a little bit of dynamic range because you've got an exponent component. Now they've got FP4. And this is where AI gets to be this black box where I'm like, how does that even work? Like, you quantize an 8-bit model down to 4 bits, uses half the VRAM. I mean, there's only 16 possibilities for a 4-bit number, whether it's floating point or integer. And I'm like, how is floating point at 4 bits even meaningful? But apparently it is. I was a computer science major, got my degree in computer science, but I don't understand this stuff. I mean, we were doing 64-bit floating point was pretty much what floating point was back when I was in school. All right. 25090s to trigger the 50 gig LLMs. Yeah. I mean, if they work, right? If you can use them together. I haven't tried that either. I haven't tried doing LLM stuff on multiple 4090s or 4080s or whatever. I don't know how hard that is to get working. And your communication between systems is also a factor, not systems, but GPUs, because on chip, your bandwidth, on a 4090, it's a terabyte per second of bandwidth. And if you go off that GPU to the other GPU through the PCI Express interface, you're down to, is it 32 gigabytes per second for a 16-lane PCIe 4.0? It might be double that. I can't keep these numbers straight. There's too many of them in my head. With the 5090 being PCIe 5.0, and I did check when it was running, and yes, it's running in 5.0 mode. They're not lying. I don't know how much of a performance difference there is. That's something that might be interesting to look at if I had another day to do benchmarks. Would be to test the 5090 in PCIe 4.0 and maybe even 3.0, just to say, hey, same system running in 3 different generations of PCI Express. How does that impact performance? For gaming, I suspect the impact is going to be a lot smaller than most people might imagine it would be, because the PCIe bandwidth is so low compared to on-card bandwidth. So when you're doing AI models between 2 4090s, I guess if they're balanced well so that they don't need to share their memory. Anyway, I never finished my thought there. It's actually 4-bit floating point T-flops, if you want to call that. Whereas most NPUs, when they say tops, they mean 8-bit integer tops. And in my mind, at least, 8-bit integer would be better than 4-bit floating point because it's got twice as many bits and you can store more context, if you want to call that, more dynamic range, more whatever, for training purposes, for inference purposes. But they're saying, like, NVIDIA has demonstrations where they had the flux.dev AI image generation model running in FP4 mode. And I mean, if you're magnifying and pixel peeping, maybe it looks a little different than FP8 mode or FP16 mode. But for a lot of people, it would be good enough. So these transformer models and these low floating point bit depths, they're able to do interesting stuff with them. All right, back to benchmarking. Yeah. Bring you closer. Let's see, camera. What I need is a zoom. No one said anything, so we'll go with Dragon Age: The Veilguard. How about? It seems like a pretty good game. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Like, I think the reviews have been pretty solid. From what I poked at, I was like, no, this looks like a reasonably fun Dragon Age sequel. I think I beat the first one. I didn't quite get into the second one, and was it Inquisition that I didn't. I barely played it all. I think Inquisition actually had AMD's Mantle support was a big thing that they made at the time. They're like, oh yeah, low level API. Do that. Oh, for a second I thought that had locked up. But I remember the Mantle benchmark was also really sketchy. We're going to bring you back because that's going to take a few minutes. This is the other joy of benchmarking GPUs. Every time you swap GPUs, an angel gets its wings. No, every time you swap GPUs, you get shader compiles in games. So this one, we're at 10% now since launch, plugging away. Some of the games take even longer. Stalker 2 takes a while. Trying to think. The Last of Us takes a little bit. God of War takes a little bit. There's a lot that don't do this, and then there's others that do, and it can be very lengthy. Oh, that's Sarah. She says Veilguard is solid. 20 years ago, me really wants to play through Veilguard and Baldur's Gate 3. Current me just doesn't have the time. I'm busy benchmarking, which is sad. So I need like a clone of me to run my benchmarks, and then I can play games again. Anyone know how to make that happen? Holy cow. This feels slower than I remember. It's probably because normally, see, what I should have done is I should have started this running and walked away on my break, because this is going to take several minutes. Anyway, questions, comments? What do you want to know? 50 series architecture. So there's this, I'll angle it like this. There's this mentality of people where they're like, oh, Ada wasn't really new. It was just a die shrink of Ampere and ported from Samsung 8 nanometer to TSMC 4 nanometer. But it's really just the same architecture. And there are definitely similarities, right? But there are enough changes that the drivers do need different optimizations for Ada generation than what they used for Ampere generation. And I assume that's the same case with Blackwell. So that even though you might think Blackwell is the same as Ada, and hey, the drivers should just work, NVIDIA's software people have almost certainly been working for a long time, months, a year, I don't know, to get Blackwell optimizations working in all these games. And are they all ready? If it's like past situations, no, they're not. You will get games where it works fine, and you'll get the expected performance uplift compared to 4090. And I'm sure there will be games where you will see like either static performance, even though the 5090 is supposed to be faster, or even a performance regression where it's like, hey, the optimizations for Blackwell aren't as mature as the optimizations for Ada. And so until, could take weeks, months, they'll need to update things. Some of my benchmarks, without discussing performance, because there is no performance to discuss. So I started using Procyon from UL, the people who make PC Mark and 3D Mark. They've got this package called Procyon, and they've added a bunch of AI benchmarks to it. So there's Stable Diffusion 1.5, Stable Diffusion XL. There's a version of Stable Diffusion for NPUs that I don't run because I'm not doing NPUs right now. And then there's like an AI vision test that's doing things like ResNet 50 and some older AI tests. And there's also, what's the other one? There's text generation. And so those exist, and they have Tensor RT optimizations for NVIDIA cards. They have OpenVINO optimizations for Intel Arc cards. And then I think AMD's GPUs are just using DirectML. But does Tensor RT work in the public version on a 50 series for all of those tests? Probably not. Probably will need patches. And I think that'll happen with a lot of different software packages where it's like, even though it's NVIDIA hardware, the 50 series is different enough that certain things that work on Ada may not work without driver updates, which is kind of annoying. Or they might deliver lower than expected performance without driver updates, which is also annoying. Man, I wish I was looking at my frame or my live stream. I thought this camera would be 60. Oh, and it's telling me my connection is unstable right now. Sarah's been trying to get a 4070. You've got a, what do you have? A 4070 Ti Super, 4070 Ti? You've got a good card, baby. We're almost done. We're almost done. I don't have any extra 4090s. See, and this was the interesting thing. So 30 series, the 3080 Ti was basically almost identical performance to the 3090, with the exception of it had half as much VRAM. And that mattered in a few scenarios, but for games, it didn't really matter back then. Nowadays, the 24 versus 12, there were probably games where they could exceed the 12 gigabytes. But the 40 series, like, there's a huge gap between a 4080 and a 4090 and a 4080 Super and a 4090. Like, just massive. The 4080 Super, I think, has 82 SMs, streaming multiprocessors, compared to 128 on the 4090. And the 4080, not Super, was like 80 SMs. So you had almost 50% more SMs, basically. Actually, it's more than 50% more, plus more memory and other stuff. Hey, we're into Veilguard finally. Let's bring you back. I know. Motion sickness. We'll put you right straight on, or at least try to put you straight on. This is probably as close as I can get. Okay, we need to change some settings though. All right, so we got 1080p, upscaling is off, TAA high, apply that. When you switch between cards, it often gets confused and resolution changes to random stuff. Like I was at 1280 by 1024. I haven't used a 5:4 aspect ratio display since probably 2002 or something. Not personally anyway. Then we're on medium settings. Ray tracing is off. I'm not testing ray tracing in Dragon Age Veilguard because basically it does help certain things look better, but the performance hit is pretty large and I just didn't feel like it was worthwhile. So we'll start with medium. And this is another game where if you switch from medium to ultra, which I will in a minute, you have to restart. What do you call it? You have to restart the game. Gotta bash the barrels, right? Dang barrels, always getting in my way. So my last benchmark suite was what? I would say it was maybe half and half between manual benchmarks like I'm doing here and built-in benchmarks. The one before that was almost all built-in benchmarks. And then this suite, I've decided to go almost all manual benchmarks, or at least in-game benchmarks. So Black Myth Wukong is built-in benchmark. F124 is mostly a built-in benchmark. The flight simulator games are in engine, but they're a test sequence that doesn't require as much input from me. Minecraft doesn't require much input from me. And I think that's it. So like 5 games that I can walk away from the computer while I benchmark, and 17 games that that I need to sit here for every test, every pixel that's rendered. And there's people who are like, yeah, you need to automate that stuff. And that would be cool. I know some places do automation, but at the same time, when you automate, if I automated every benchmark and I could start it and walk away and come back in 10 hours and collect my results, that would be super convenient. And I would have literally zero idea about whether everything rendered properly, whether there were any odd glitches. So this is why Riva Tuner Statistics Server is running, because it lets me see in real time what the frame pacing or frame times look like. And that should be a generally smooth line. If you see a bunch of spikes happening, it's either bad drivers or bad game code or the GPU running out of VRAM or something. And so that's useful. Like there was a big spike right there. Why? I don't know. It just did. It spiked for unknown reasons. And so that one had a 195 average and a 1% low of 129. If that spike hadn't occurred, the 1% low might have been like 140 or 150. I don't know. There are games that they do an autosave periodically. I think that's what the purple icon in the bottom right corner means. Is it it's autosaving. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle does an autosave at pretty regular intervals, and when you're leaving and entering certain areas, and it causes a big spike every time it autosaves, like a frame time spike. Very noticeable. It's a very distinct hitch where for 1 or 2 frames, it will drop from say 100 frames per second down to like 10. See, in that one, oh, I still got 128 FPS on the 1% low. That's interesting. I don't think they're calculating 1% lows properly, or at least not the way I've calculated them. So Ultra turns on ray tracing, which I then turn off. It's selective ray tracing. You can see what it does in the background. It really doesn't do much unless there's water present. And then I also turn off motion blur. Death to motion blur. Some people like it, I don't. So I've got to exit and restart. So I said it got 127 on minimums, on 1% lows. And my 1% lows, oh, no, they're pretty much right there. Yeah. 127.8, 125.9. Okay. Man, I didn't see that many frame time spikes. Oh, no, I forget what games are like. What? Hello. That's interesting. It was unable to sync with Steam. Luckily, the second time you launch it, the long shader compilation time doesn't occur. So, Video Cruiser, one of our big articles and one of the one of the things I maintain for Tom's Hardware is the GPU benchmarks hierarchy. What? Did I lose connection? Hold on a second. No, I'm still connected. That's weird. I wonder if my streaming is interfering. Continue. Okay. So one of the things that I do is this GPU benchmarks hierarchy. And in order to compare everything, like, you need to be able to test it. And what that means is if you enable every setting on every game, there are cards that you can't run that game on anymore. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing, but it just means, like, the more ray tracing games I do, the fewer old cards I'm able to compare with. So I do rasterization and ray tracing. And what I really look at is what the game looks like with and without various settings to a certain degree. I do generally run the ultra presets for maxed out settings, but the net result is I test 4 settings: 1080p medium-ish, 1080p ultra, 1440p ultra, 4K ultra. And some cards like the 4090, 4080 Super, 5090, 1080p feels very superfluous. It's like, well, who cares about 1080p benchmarks? You're going to be CPU limited. And I'm like, yes, you are. But we still need to be able to show that and see where those benchmarks, or which games are CPU limited and which are not. So I will max out some games and I won't max out others, is what it comes down to. Some people say you should always test with DLSS upscaling enabled, and I disagree. I want everything to be on equal footing, and there is no equal footing when you're comparing FSR 2.3 or XESS 1.3 and DLSS 2 or 3 or 4. Gosh, she's in my way. Get out of my way, girl. She hasn't even moved. Come on. See, I have starting points where I basically stand right here, and I put it so that my head is right at the bottom of that orange tree. And so when she's blocking that, I can't line up my spot properly. Try and run the same route every time as much as possible. That's what systematic benchmarking is. And you know, you see YouTube videos where people are running around doing whatever. They're like, hey, look at this game, and it got this much FPS. And then on the, you know, card X, and then they go, and on card Y, and they run through a completely different sequence. And they're like, yeah, it's performing worse. I'm like, no, that's not benchmarking. You need to do the same stupid sequence on every card in the same way as much as possible. So this is why 1% lows are so low. That little section right there, this card dropped down to like 100 something FPS, like 105, 110. Whereas right now we're at 160 FPS. I forgot about that. So Dragon Age Veilguard, at least in this area, and that just means throughout the game, like, there are big swings in performance that you can expect to see depending on the complexity of the scene. So this is a longer benchmark than Control. Control was 30 seconds. This one's 50 seconds. In part, that's because I'm running a loop, this path, and it takes about 50 seconds to run this loop. So rather than doing a shorter loop and doubling back, or testing in an area that has a shorter loop, I found this area of the game after playing it for a bit, and I was like, oh, this is more demanding. That lake there causes a performance drop, and this sequence right here causes a big performance drop. And I was like, okay, so this might not be the most demanding area of the game, but it's more demanding than a lot of the other areas I'd seen. And that's kind of what I wanted to stick with, is something that's a reasonable representation of how bad can things get in general without, like, spending forever to play through the whole game, Sarah. One thing I have noticed is that this OLED display takes longer to switch between resolutions than my last display. Like my last display would switch resolutions in almost instantly. And I like that. This one, every time you change resolutions and refresh rates, there's like a 1 to 2 second black screen effect where it has to, I don't know, resync or whatever. It just feels weird because I'm like, do you really need to power off everything on the display to switch? I have an old display that it could switch between 4K, 1440p, and 1080p, and any other resolution really instantly. Like it never went black. You'd say, hey, switch from 4K to 1080p and hit apply, and it just kind of flash, and you'd see the new resolution in effect. It was awesome. These are first world problems, I know. First world PC hardware problems. Other people are like, hey, I want a $1,300 OLED display. But as I said this earlier, I don't remember when I said it, but if you're planning on buying a 5090, this is the kind of display that you should have. And I don't mean to say like you need to buy MSI's display. I mean to say you should have a high refresh rate 4K display. If you only have an ultra wide 1440p display, you're probably not going to see as much of a performance benefit out of a 5090. And if you have like a 1080p double wide display, so 25 or 3840 by 1080, half the resolution of 4K, you will see much less of a benefit out of a top-end card like a 5090. You want to kind of keep a balance between your GPU, your CPU, your display, your resolution, your refresh rate, all that stuff. It's also interesting. Oh, yeah. So this one, that's weird. The 5090 didn't expose some of those intermediate resolutions. Not that I ever use those resolutions for testing, but like it went from 4K to 1440p to 1080p and eliminated about half of the extra resolutions that I don't use. I wonder if that was by intent or if there's something else going on there. Two more runs of Veilguard, and then next up would be F1, or we can skip F1 and go to Flight Simulator. Flight Simulator 2024. There's also, what else is in Steam? A Plague Tale Requiem, Stalker 2, and Starfield. Let me know what you think we should test next. I know it's the 4080 Super. It's not that exciting compared to the 5090. We'll do 5090 maybe over the weekend or next week or something. I don't know. We'll do it after the launch. How's that? So MSI is supposed to be sending a card. It got stuck in customs. I don't know why. Like MSI is like, no, customs should be sorted, but customs, I guess it may have looked suspect because the card's going to a residence. I work from home instead of a business. Asus said they would try and send a card. I don't have confirmation that that's happening. Colorful, I think, is sending a card, but I don't know if they said they were sending a 5090 or 5080. Some of these companies are planning to send like a 5080 or a lower tier card for review. Was that 2 runs? I don't know. I'll do another 4K run just in case. But yeah, once the embargo is done, if you guys like this sort of video, let us know. Give us a thumbs up, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Share it with your friends, your neighbors, your underage children, and tell us, yeah, we want to see live benchmarking of a 5090. Prior to embargo, we can't do that, obviously. And cutting together a more professional video is possible, but it's time consuming. And we're not really a video website. We do things the old-fashioned way with text and images and charts. Videos can be good, but they also, like, you got to be careful how you do them. If I were not streaming from a webcam hooked up to a different PC, I'd be impacting performance. Is that realistic? Well, it is in some cases, and it's not in others. All right, 1080p. So this is just reverting to my old settings before I leave, so that when I swap to the next card, it's ready. If you think this is boring, don't become a hardware reviewer. This is what I do, hours and hours and hours each week. Okay, let's see. 146. Okay. All right, going to check chat. Anyone have a request? Sorry, alarm going off. So, let's see. So Brian Catanzaro, he did one of the presentations at CES Editors Day that I was at, and I spoke with him afterwards, asked some questions. You know, super smart guy and knows all sorts of stuff. Obviously, who was AI modeling the pixels? Was that an interview with some other website? Because what did he say? Spill the beans, Video Cruiser. I probably haven't seen if it's not the main video where he showed off DLSS 4, I probably haven't seen it. Okay. No one's requesting anything. We'll go on to next up. Let's see, I gotta change my time. F-124 Horizon Forbidden West. Yeah, we'll just go in order. Anyone want to watch F-124? Great. We'll launch F-124. And I'll pull back while it loads. Talk. So actually, Brian Catanzaro, he came up to me and said, "Hey, I've read a lot of your stuff that you've written, and I just really like how thoughtful you are about things." I was like, "Oh man, that was nice to hear." Oh man, I'm watching the video in the background, and it's like 10 seconds delayed, so that freaked me out for a minute. But yeah, I was asking him. So at CES, they revealed multi-frame generation in DLSS 4. And then we had a Q&A session the next morning after the keynote with their CEO, Jensen Huang, whatever. And I asked a question. I said, so with multi-frame generation, are you doing interpolation or are you doing projection, predicting the future frames? And both are possible to varying extents. They just work in different ways. This is, as I was saying, one of the kind of canned benchmarks. So I'll let it run in the background. But so I asked Jensen this, and he said, "Oh no, we're predicting the future, not interpolating the past." Something to that effect. So then I wrote about this. I was like, "Whoa, that's huge!" So they're basically projecting and inpainting, which it turns out they are doing that for Reflex 2. But for DLSS 4 multi-frame gen, they are not predicting frames. They are interpolating between two existing rendered frames. See, so this one turned on DLSS mode when I switched GPUs. So you got to make sure that gets turned back off. Oh, that's interesting. You didn't have to redo things. Oh, and then it also changed settings. So for F124, what I found is that medium settings on their own is super easy to run. You guys can't see this. Let me put you closer. Medium settings on their own is way too easy. Like you're getting 300 frames per second or more. It's just kind of silly. Even with all these ray traced effects enabled, it still runs at relatively high performance mode. So that's what I opted to do. Ultra mode does turn on ray tracing as well. So I was like, well, I don't want a game where it's ray traced at ultra and not ray traced at medium, because then how do I count that in my GPU benchmarks hierarchy? So I decided to stick with ray tracing on this one. And the full benchmark lap is like 2 minutes long. But after the first 60 seconds, I'm like, you're not really getting any new information. So I halt the benchmark. Oh, so back to my story. So Jensen says they're predicting the future, not interpolating the past. And so then the next day, at the editor's day, which was embargoed until January 15th, so we had like a week almost to write this up, I asked him about that specifically. I said, hey, Jensen said this, and I just want to clarify, is that correct? He says, oh no, we're doing interpolation. And I'm just like, oh crud. Now I've written an article, it's posted and it's live, and I've said, this is what Jensen said, and he did say it. And how do you say, like, hey, a trillion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar company CEO actually gave me the wrong information? It's not my fault. He made a mistake, but it's interesting when you think about what he said and you go, okay, Blackwell is out the door now. We're reviewing it. We'll have reviews live by January 30th. And so Blackwell is done, which means that NVIDIA is already hard at work on the next generation and probably the generation after that. So DLSS 4 right now, combined with Reflex 2. Reflex 2 does some projection. It predicts where the camera will be, renders from that point, does a warp at the end of the rendering, and then does AI inpainting to fill in the blanks that are exposed, the disoccluded areas of the screen. And it's like, well, that's not all that different from if you were using frame generation to predict the future. And the reason predicting the projection would be cool is because you could actually do it without having the latency penalty that's currently present in FSR3 and DLSS 3 frame gen. And it's also basically the same in DLSS 4 frame gen, because you're rendering frame 1, rendering frame, well, either 3 or 5, and then either you're predicting or interpolating 1 frame for DLSS 3, or you're interpolating up to 3 frames with DLSS 4. So what comes after Blackwell and DLSS 4? I'm sure at some point we are going to have frame projection and prediction, extrapolation, whatever you want to call it, rather than rather than the interpolation that we're currently using. And when you think about it, like I've had some people say, no, that would just be too hard. And I'm like, well, if you're running at, say, 10 frames per second, your camera could shift a lot between frames. And predicting the next frame based on a low frame rate would be really hard and ugly, because you would have, potentially every pixel in the screen has changed significantly, and you're trying to project this. But that's not the point of frame generation. The frame generation isn't supposed to take 20 frames per second and turn it into 40. It's really for, you're already running at like 60 or 80 frames per second, and you're trying to turn that into like 120 to 160 or something. And in that case, it's like, well, the difference between frame 1 and frame 2, or frame n and frame n plus 1, when you're only predicting 10 milliseconds into the future or 5 milliseconds into the future, it's really not that big of a jump. Like your pixels take a little shift, and so it's like, yeah, there's maybe a little bit of white over here that you'd have to fill in, and maybe a few things around the edges of objects get filled in. But they're already doing that with Reflex 2. They've showed us that they're doing that with this camera warping and in painting. And so, did Jensen conflate Reflex 2 with DLSS 4 and give me a slightly wrong answer? Or is he talking about potentially DLSS 5, because that's where everyone at NVIDIA is now focusing on the next generation after Blackwell? I wouldn't be surprised if we get frame prediction rather than frame interpolation with the next generation, if not sooner. Like, I think all the hardware is probably there with the RTX 50 series, using their thousands of AI tops to do a reasonable job at frame prediction. And it's not going to be really any worse than frame interpolation, because if you have a big shift in camera with interpolation, it's actually messier, because you could, if you take like Flight Simulator as an example, you can go one frame is inside the camera, and the next frame, one frame is inside the cockpit, and the next frame is you've switched to an external view. And how do you interpolate between those two views? Well, if you were doing prediction instead, you would take like frame n and frame n plus 1, or frame n minus 1 and frame n, so the previous frame and the current frame, and you would project where the next frame should be. You'd render that, or AI generate that. And let's say the next frame goes from being a cockpit to an external view. You get this big swap in image, this viewport, but it doesn't really matter, because you would have had that big swap anyway. And so the interpolation will actually have a harder time of making a good looking image, because you'll have one frame is inside the cockpit, the next frame is outside the plane. And how do you merge between those? You can't. Whereas the prediction, you'd have inside the cockpit, it's going to predict, hey, let's assume the next frame will also be inside the cockpit. And then it turns out it's not, but it doesn't matter, because we just show the outside the cockpit, and now we predict the next frame outside the cockpit. That's all to say that I think frame prediction is probably not all that far off. Now, multi-frame prediction maybe gets a little messier, but at the same time, if you're running at 60 frames per second and you predict one frame ahead, you have 16 milliseconds to do it. Well, what if we're rendering at 60 frames per second and we now predict 3 frames, and each one only takes 5 milliseconds to generate, and there's less of a change between each of those frames? So in my mind, at least, and I'm not this AI expert, but I think frame prediction is far closer than some people would say. That's my take. DLSS 5, will it be frame prediction? I don't know. Could it come before DLSS 5? Could it come before the 60 series? Maybe. I'm trying to change my camera. There. How's that? Straight on view. Guys, you're not asking questions. I'm just leaving this on the background, hearing the dulcet tones of Jared's warbling voice while benchmarks run. If so, I appreciate it. And I know you want to see 5090, and we can't show it. We can't even really talk about any results that we might have. You'll get them soon enough. And then you'll have to try and buy one, which, again, I said earlier, I think the cards are going to sell out in a big way. And unfortunately, I think there will be scalping. And me saying that is not going to encourage scalping, because scalpers are probably already planning this, with or without guys like me saying scalpers are probably going to do this, because they can see the market. And we're getting a card that costs $2,000 that will outperform the professional cards of the last generation that cost $4,000. So anyone who was doing AI on an RTX 5000 Ada generation, I think that's the right professional GPU. That's basically the RTX 4080 with double the VRAM and professional drivers. So those were like $4,000. And now we're going to have a card that actually has a 512-bit interface with GDDR7 and 32 gigabytes instead of a 256-bit interface with GDDR6 and 32 gigabytes. And it's going to have, compared to like the RTX 5000 Ada generation, I think those had around 80 SMs. And this one, the 5090, it has 170 SMs. And so if you were previously buying a $4,000 professional card or thinking about it to do AI work, now you have a $2,000 consumer card that will be twice as fast and will have FP4 support. So it could be up to 3 or 4 times as fast in certain AI benchmarks and workloads. How much will AI people pay for that kind of card? I think a lot more than gamers. And so I think we're going to be, it hopefully won't be as bad as the crypto mining situation. But could it be? Yeah, it could be. I always love stuff like this. So you tell it to confirm that you want the mode change. You say, okay, then you say, yes, confirm, and then you accept the mode change after it. Like nothing like making you click 5 times rather than once. And why is the run benchmark all the way at the bottom of the list rather than like the first item? Because normally I would just, now that I've set my benchmark, I would just want to click enter. But instead I have to click down 6 times first. What are we up to? 1440p? Cruising along still. See, and so this is with all their ray tracing effects. And I will say, like, if you look at F124 and turn off all the ray tracing, I did that at one point and I really didn't see that much benefit to the ray tracing. It doesn't like look amazingly better. I actually think these 2 mirrors, they do ray trace them. I'm not positive on that. I'm pretty sure I looked at that, and that was one of the changes. So those 2 little tiny mirrors with ray tracing enabled, they actually show what's behind you. Without ray tracing, they're just kind of approximations that are a little blobby and don't really show any detail. But those are such a small part of the screen that they don't really matter. And that's how a lot of ray tracing is. Like screen space reflections can do a good job of approximating reflections very quickly in a lot of scenarios. And so the difference between screen space reflections and ray tracing comes down to how much compute you want to throw at either one, and the resulting quality isn't usually night and day difference. It's more like Well, it's the difference between late afternoon and evening, except that the evening, the ray tracing runs half as fast, or 1/3 as fast if you're doing full ray tracing. That's where we're heading eventually, maybe. But if you look at the computer hardware available right now, we are a long way off from being able to do full path tracing on like $300, $400 graphics cards. I mean, you can kind of do it with frame generation and with upscaling, and that's what NVIDIA is pushing. But you're not getting full fidelity, full performance, reduced input latency, all that stuff. Well, Adokay Godrilla, I hope you're right. I'm not trying to create FUD. That is not what I'm about. And I think anyone who thinks that the 5090s won't sell out, they're not living in reality. The 4090s have been selling for over $2,000 for months now. Partly because of scarcity, because they stopped being manufactured, I would assume. But also, like, were gamers buying 4090s at $2,000 and up? Heck no. It was the AI people, AI bros. So if you want a 5090 for gaming and you can find one for $2,000, I think you'll be lucky. I think we will see scalpers and others charge way more than that. There's actually, I have a contact. So this is heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from another. He's been messing around. This contact said that one of the brick and mortar stores, I won't name names, that they were not getting very many 5090 cards at all. Now, does that mean it's because Best Buy is getting all the Founders Edition cards first? Possibly. That seems a reasonable assumption. NVIDIA did that with the 20 series. They launched the Founders Edition first, and then the partner cards came a month later. And companies like EVGA were ticked off. And so after the 30 series, I don't think the 30 series was quite as bad, but they still kind of did that. They just didn't have a Founders Edition model that cost $100 extra. And so EVGA left the market. But with the 40 series, I don't think there were extra Founders Edition cards at launch compared to other brands. So will there be extra 50 series Founders Editions compared to like the third party Asus, MSI, Gigabyte, Zotac, PNY, Colorful, all these other brands? I don't know. I've actually been trying to talk to my industry contacts at these companies and say, hey, what you expect of supply for the 5090 launch? And most of them are saying it seems to be about the same as what we had with the 40 series, but they're also saying we don't really have any deep insight to that because that's a whole different division of the company. So all I've got is a guy who's in the tech industry who he wants to buy 3 5090 cards for launch, not before, but at launch. He's willing to pay full price for them, and he's got a friend at a company who sells graphics cards and other computer hardware that has been able to set aside 3 cards for him on every GPU launch, going back to like, I don't know, 5-10 years. And this guy said, I'm sorry, we have such limited quantities of the 5090 coming in that I can't get you 3 cards at launch. I can get you 1, and you'll have to wait probably a month before I can get you the other 2. Rumors. We will see in a couple weeks how many 5090 cards are actually available. and how quickly they sell out and how high prices go. I fully expect to see companies like Asus and MSI have like top tier models. They're everything plus the kitchen sink models. I suspect they'll be $2,200 and up MSRP. I don't think anyone has have they announced MSRPs for the non-Founders Edition? Like, we know $2,000 is the baseline, but has Asus said how much their ROG Strix whatever will cost? Let me know in chat. Last run of F1 2024. No, it's not 2024. It's just F1 24. Yeah, I didn't think we had AIB pricing yet. What they're doing is they're trying. I bet the AIBs are all trying to figure out how much they can charge. Because once you announce pricing and set contract pricing with your suppliers and retail distributors and all that stuff, you're kind of locked into that as a company, and that burned a lot of the GPU or graphics card vendors with the crypto mining era, because they would have like Best Buy or whoever, Fry's, Newegg, Amazon, they would have contracts with those distributors saying, hey, we'll sell you a 3080 for $750. Or, I mean, it wouldn't have been $750, right? Because there's a markup. So that maybe they say, hey, we'll sell you this card for $600, and then you can sell it at $750 as our recommended price. And then all of a sudden, after the 3080 and 3090 launched, we had this mining boom with Ethereum, where at one point it was making $15 per day per GPU. And so you had all these miners willing to pay $1,000 and more for a 3080, $2,000, $3,000 even for a 3090. And most of that money did not go to Asus or MSI or whatever, because it was the retailers that were able to mark it up. And there were scalpers doing it too. But we got all these jacked up prices for basically, I would say it impacted the 40 series MSRPs for sure. And so that lasted 3 years pretty much of messed up GPU prices. I was pleasantly surprised that the 50 series was, I won't say it's affordable, but it could have been worse. Like that, the 5070 is $549, so it's the same price as the current 4070. After the 4070 price dropped, right? It was $599. Then when the 4070 Super came out, it dropped to $549, and so they're keeping that price with the 5070. So that was good. But there's also the other side of that, which is how much faster will the 5070 be than the 4070? And it's not going to be that big of a gap unless you factor in multi-frame generation, which I'm kind of like very marketing heavy. But yeah, I think we'll probably see maybe a 10 to 20% uplift at the 5070 level. And it's still only 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which it's enough for most games. I won't say it's not enough for most current games, but is it enough for future games? And that is less clear. And then we've got the 5070 laptop GPU. Gosh, I was really hopeful, maybe naive, but I was hopeful that NVIDIA would use 3 gigabyte GDDR7 chips on pretty much anything below the 5090 level. So I was hoping that we'd have a 5080 with 24 gigabytes at launch. So it'd be 3 gigabyte chips, 6 channels, no, 8 channels, 3 gigabyte GDDR7 chips on a 256-bit bus to get you to 256 gigabytes. And, you know, when they revealed the specs, they didn't do that. But they didn't announce a 5060 or 5060 Ti, but they did announce a laptop 5070 that is 8 gigabytes and a 128-bit bus. And so I look at that and I'm going, okay, so probably we're going to get a 5060 with 8 gigabytes again. Not happy about that. I think the 4060 is probably one of the worst cards we've seen in a while, because the 3060 12 gigabyte was a perfect blend of features and specs. And then they walked back and went from a 192-bit interface and 12 gigabytes of VRAM to a 128-bit interface with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And they did it on the 4060 Ti as well. And I was like, oh man, that stinks. Was performance generally better than a 3060? Yes, but we're getting more edge cases now where there are new games, especially Unreal Engine 5 games, I think I've seen it in, where memory use has gone up enough that the 3060 12 gigabyte matches the 4060. And we're going to do that all over again with a 5060 probably? Yuck. So, a few questions from Aberke. Aberke? I don't know how to say your name. Sorry. So the 5090 Founders Edition has a nice heat sink, uses liquid metal, which, you know, it's thin, and it's supposed to cool 500 watts, 575 watts. And the liquid metal means don't disassemble this, as far as I know. I don't use liquid metal normally, but yeah, you can screw things up with if you try and take off the cooler from a liquid metal card, is my understanding, whether that's a CPU or a GPU. So that definitely adds to the cost somewhat, but keep in mind, like, NVIDIA is the one making the GPUs, and so they don't have to pay NVIDIA for the GPUs. Like, they did all the R&DS, but if you think about, let's just for reference, let's say TSMC charges $20,000 for an NVIDIA 4N process node GPU, and the GB202 is 750 millimeters squared, which means they get something like, I think up to 75 chips per wafer. It's close enough to that, right? You go, okay, so what is 20,000 divided by 75? And that works out to about $267. Okay, that's a really expensive chip. It is. I mean, iPhone chips are what, like 150 millimeters squared? They're pretty dang small by comparison. But iPhones also don't sell for $2,000. So NVIDIA makes this $270 chip, let's call it, and they've got to add memory, and maybe the memory costs, I don't know, let's be generous, let's say it costs $200. The PCB, the printed circuit board, VRMs, cooling, power circuitry, all that other stuff. I mean, how much realistically does all of that add? Maybe another $200? So pretty much we're looking at a card where the total bill of materials, in my mind, just ballparking, I don't have like hard research numbers here, but just ballparking estimate, the hardware for a 5090 Founders Edition card like this probably costs in the vicinity of $700, and they're selling it for $2,000. How much does it cost for Asus or MSI to do something similar? Well, they don't get the GPU for $270 anymore. And they don't get the memory for $200 anymore. They have to pay NVIDIA's price, which might be double that. Margins get thin. I mean, this is the whole EVGA thing, right? This is EVGA's CEO was like, felt disrespected by Jensen Huang, left the industry. They don't do graphics cards anymore. And it was because the margins had gotten so thin and NVIDIA was taking a bigger and a bigger slice of the pie. The Founders Edition takes a huge slice of the pie. Anyone who buys a Founders Edition, probably of the cost of the card, so $2,000, maybe 30% of that goes to distributors and resellers and whatnot. And the remaining amount goes to NVIDIA. And so you say, okay, well, that's $1,400, and we subtract the bill of materials of $700, so NVIDIA gets $700 in profit. Like, even if I'm off by hundreds of dollars, NVIDIA makes like easily $500 per 5090 Founders Edition is my assumption of profit, and that goes into paying for all the R&D and all that stuff. I know, but if you compare that to Asus and these third-party cards, I think they probably make half as much per card as NVIDIA, because they're not the manufacturer of the GPU. So their margins are slimmer. So, you know, if you get an MSI card for, say, $2,250, maybe they make the same $500, but it costs $250 more than the Founders Edition. And they had to charge that extra money in order to make more of a profit, so that it becomes more viable for them and they can continue to do their R&D efforts. Here's a question for chat. Who has replaced EVGA in your minds? Anyone? I mean, like, for a while, if you asked people, like, who's the best NVIDIA GPU manufacturer, graphics card manufacturer, for a while, everyone would say EVGA, and now they're gone. So is it Asus? Is it MSI? I'm pretty sure. Well, I won't color your opinions. Who do you guys think is the best add-in board manufacturer these days, and why? I know, based off of traffic to our articles and reviews, that Asus seems to get way more traffic when we review one of their things than the other brands. But sometimes that's also timing. Like, if Asus is the second card we review, you know, the first card, the initial review of a 5090 Founders Edition goes up, maybe, I'm not saying these are actual numbers, but to make it math easy, let's say it gets 100,000 page views. And then the Asus 5090 gets reviewed. Maybe it only gets 50,000 page views. And then by the time we're down to the third tier manufacturers, Zotac comes along, maybe they only get 20,000 page views. So there's timing there. By being the first card that we can review officially, the NVIDIA Founders Edition cards get way more traffic than all of the partner cards. But there are brand name things that also play into that. So my experience is that Asus has a better brand recognition than just about any other add-in board manufacturer. I would say it goes like Asus, then MSI, then probably Gigabyte. And after Gigabyte, I don't know. Like, there's Zotac, PNY, and Colorful, and some other brands that I'm forgetting. Who am I forgetting? But there's a big gap in US brand recognition, at least between the top three and then the next three. See, I'm talking and now I forget how many times I've run the benchmark. So we'll run an extra just in case. Horizon Forbidden West. That's what I'm benchmarking right now, if you're wondering. Who likes this more than the original? I've heard a lot of people say Horizon Zero Dawn was better. I've even heard a lot of people say we think Horizon Zero Dawn looks better as well. That, like, the dreadlock thing that Aloy has going on, that's her name, right? Aloy, I don't know. It looks kind of weird. Like when it's still, it looks okay, and then she starts shifting around, and you're like, oh, those are like big snakes of hair. Kind of weird. I'm looking at chat. Well, that was a question. Okay, let's talk about this. Is frame gen coming to other GPUs? I mean, in theory, it's totally doable. Like that's so multi-frame gen. They've added, what did they call it? It's the flip pacer. I don't know. There's like a hardware element in the 50 series to help schedule frames from frame generation to be sent to the monitor. And I guess like they haven't really gone into a lot of detail about it, but to me it seems like flip metering, I think they call it. It seems like if you took rendered frame 1 and rendered frame 2, and you're going to generate 3 frames in between them, and you go, okay, there was a 15 millisecond gap between those, so they now have hardware that basically tries to pace the next 3 frame transitions at 5 milliseconds each. Whereas when they were doing that in drivers and on the CPU for the RTX 40 series DLSS 3 frame gen, there was more variability, they said, in the flipping, the metering of the flips. And so it wasn't as consistent as they wanted. And of course, they were only doing 1 frame with the 40 series. And so going up to 3 frames, they wanted that to be more precise. So multi-frame gen, even if they could do all the calculations properly, could they pace them appropriately to make it look good on like a 40 series or a 30 series? Honestly, I think probably they could. I think there's a lot of marketing there that they're saying there's a lot of new tech in the 50 series to make this better. But how much better is it really? How important is the hardware flip metering really? That's something that only people like Brian Catanzaro would really know the answer to. And if it's partly marketing that they want to encourage people to buy a 50 series, they won't tell the full real answer. Now, they've upgraded. So with the 40 series, they had the optical flow accelerator. They made a big deal about this at the 40 series launch. The OFA hardware did like 320 tops of performance. Now, I thought at the time that was int 8 tera ops, and I think that's correct, but I don't know that they ever explicitly said whether it was doing int 8 or something else. But so they had the OFA that was supposed to calculate the motion vectors between the frames, and then that was used to help do the frame generation. And because that was all done as a fixed functional unit, actually I need to run this again. The OFA, it was fixed function hardware, and what they discovered was with more advanced AI models and more training over time, they were able to come up with a software algorithm running in the tensor cores on the 40 series, maybe 50 series. It's, again, they aren't being super specific about this. Maybe they don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. I don't know. There are rumors that we'll get frame gen for not 40 series and not 50 series. I'll believe it when I see it, mostly not because I don't think it can happen, but we had the potential to do frame generation with the 30 series. AMD is doing software frame generation, which it provably looks worse in most games, I think. But it also runs faster in most games than RTX 40 series frame gen. Now, with an upgraded AI algorithm and the 50 series hardware, there was no talk of the OFA anymore. It's no longer a thing. I don't know if it's even there as a legacy thing to be backward compatible with the 40 series frame gen. It seems like not. So I thought that was interesting. They removed the OFA maybe and put in FP4 support instead. If you look at die sizes for the 50 series Blackwell, they're not that different from the 40 series. Like the 5090 chip, the GB202 is definitely larger than the AD102. But GB202 has up to 192 shader SMs, streaming multiprocessors, whereas AD102 had up to 144. So it is, I mean, what is that? 33% larger, something like that. Not larger, but 33% more. And there's a lot of stuff for like memory controllers and the video codecs and if whether there's an OFA or not. There's other things that are involved in the chip. So like if you go from 20 SMs to 40 SMs in a chip design using whether it's Blackwell or Ada or Ampere or whatever, you don't double the size of the chip. Because like if you're talking Ampere or Ada as an example, let's say you start at one chip and it's the small chip maybe bottoms out at 200 millimeters squared and it only has say 20 SMs. And then you go up to the next chip has up to 32 SMs, or maybe it's 40 SMs or whatever. It's not double the size. It's maybe only 50% larger. And then you go from the 40 SM chip to like an 80 SM chip. And it's not double the 40, it's like 25% larger because there was all this baseline functionality that had to be present that doesn't scale as quickly as the number of SMs. So anyway, GB202 is 750 millimeters squared and AD102 is 608 millimeters squared, I think. It's right around that number. And so it's, what is that, like 15% larger? But it has, here, let's do the math. Let's pull out the calculator. So we got 192 divided by 144. So it has 33% more SMs, and it's 23% larger. So that kind of gives you the scaling idea. And it also, remember, it also has 33% more memory interfaces because we went from 32, or went from 24 to 32. We went from 384-bit to 512-bit. So it's 33% more memory interfaces. Those do not shrink well with a smaller process node. It's got 33% more compute units. Streaming multiprocessors, compute units is AMD verbiage. And it's only 23% larger. What was I doing? I'm getting distracted from my benchmarks. Horizon Forbidden West, done. How long has the stream been going, guys? 2 hours and 30 minutes. Holy cow. And how many of the games have I done? I'll tell you, I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've done 6 games out of 22. Do you guys want to see Indiana Jones? Should I skip that? I don't think I have time to get all the Indiana Jones testing done. Blah, blah, blah. That might be a good one for a follow-up. Yeah. Okay, I see. Hold on. let's see. Where's my chat settings? Time stats. Can I turn slow mode off? How do you set settings? No, cancel. How do you turn off slow mode on a live stream that's already running? Oh, here we go. Customization. All right. I thought 30 seconds was pretty reasonable. I was worried that we might get some spammer thing. I should have known better. There, now you can chat to your heart's content. Now I won't be able to keep up. Yeah, okay. 45 seconds. Flight Simulator. So Flight Simulator 2024, I used the same landing challenge, the Ísafjörður, whatever it's called, in Iceland. But the graphics have changed a bit, and the flight modeling has definitely changed. It's kind of funny. Let's go back. The flight modeling has definitely changed. So things like how I press the buttons to start my plane is different for the two versions, and it's kind of annoying because I have to remember them both. And performance has also definitely changed. The 2020 release is very much CPU limited, to the point where like 4080 Super, 4090 basically tie at 1440p Ultra and below. And it's only at 4K Ultra that you see a little bit of a separation between them. So, I mean, 50 series, you can pretty much assume that it's also going to be CPU bottleneck. So the 9800 X3D, the X3D chips are really beneficial in Flight Simulator 2020. In Flight Simulator 2024, the X3D chips don't seem to help as much, which was kind of interesting to see. I was like, well, why? What happened there? But the 13900K is pretty close in performance, if I remember right, to the here. I'll bring in. See, this is the one I do. Ísafjörður. So yeah, they're pretty close in performance. The 13900K and 9800 X3D. I think it's only at certain settings though. Let's see. So watch what I have to do finger-wise here. We stop the rotate, start, and we slow down to 35%. Oh, 35%. And then it flies for about 45 seconds before it almost crashes, and I stop it and repeat it. It's got a lot of water here, so it's a little more demanding, I think, than being up in the clouds. Doing 1080p medium right now, so we're getting 190-ish frames per second on a 4080 Super, which is pretty much the same as the 4090. You can guess where the 5090 might land, 5080 might land. I would assume at 1080p medium, pretty much everything from probably a 4070 Super maybe and up will get about the same performance in this test. 1080p Ultra, you'll start to see some of the slightly slower cards drop off. You know, 1440p Ultra, more of them drop off. So you do get separation as you go up the hierarchy. But yeah, let's see. Will the 50 series cards be on the graphs? You're talking about in the review? So when the reviews go up, if the 5090 and 5080 launch on the same day, the review embargo, then both would be in the charts is my expectation. If they're different days, then the 5090, like if the 5090 is first, then we won't have 5080 numbers. If the 5080 is first, we won't have 5090 numbers yet. If they're not at the same time. And I don't know if we can say when the launch embargoes are. So that's all I can say on that. But yes, by January 30th, we will have charts with both 5090 and 5080. and 4090 and 4080 Super. So this is my problem right now. I'm doing this live benchmarking, right? And I changed my test suite for the B580 launch in December. And it's like, well, why didn't you just start doing all of these card tests back in December then? And the thing is, so I crunched to get the B580 done. There was some other stuff going on. And then Christmas comes and I had a week off. So basically, I only had 1 week after the B580 launch to work. Then right after the new year, after like a few days, I had to run off to CES and was gone for almost a full week. And the net result is I didn't test any of the high-end cards before CES was done on my new test suite. I only had like the 4060, the B580, B570 got tested last week. What else? I did the RTX 3060 and the RX 7600, 7600 XT. So I did all these budget cards for the ARC reviews, and now I have to do all the high-end cards for the 5090 and 5080 reviews. And right now, I do not have those cards all tested. I've tested 5090, 4090, and I'm working on 4080 Super. Tomorrow will probably be, I probably need to do the 7900 XTX tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, I will be doing the, what's the next card? On Wednesday, I'll do the 3090. And then it's like, then I can try and do like the 4070 Ti Super and the 7900 XT. And so it's really just like, how many cards can I get done before the embargo lifts? And there's a finite amount of time. And if I work 12-hour days, I can do one card per day. And January 30th is only 9 days away. And I need to take time to actually do the writing and analysis, which usually means a solid day of doing nothing but writing and charts and all that stuff. And because there's 2 cards, that means 2 days are gone. And I don't work on Sundays, got family time and such. So if you do the math, it's like, okay, so we got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe Saturday. I'm not supposed to work Saturday, but I might have to. I'm not going to work Sunday. Then we got like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So at best, I could get 8 cards done between now and the 30th. And if I take 2 days for writing, we're down to 6 cards. But there's also the thing like the 5090, what's the competition for the 5090, right? I don't think most people who are looking at a 5090 are going to be like, well, should I get a 5090 or should I get a 4060? So there's less problems with not having a ton of cards. Like, honestly, I think anyone looking at a 5090 probably wants to know how it compares to 4090, how it compares to 3090, and then maybe like the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX for just like additional reference material. But mostly they're just like, how much faster is it than the 4090? I could do charts with like 3 GPUs, and that would probably be enough as long as the 5090 and 4090 are in that chart, right? Is chat a distraction? Not really. I mean, there's all sorts of things that I need to get done. I told my coworkers, I'm like, okay, I can't do anything else for the next 2 weeks. Please don't count on me for news editing, news writing. I will try to look, but realistically, I just need to buckle down and benchmark. And they know that. So they're helping me out. And Sarah's on the chat. hanging out with us just because she's bored. I don't know if she's still here though. Maybe she left. She got tired of me rambling. So this was what I was saying at the start, is I'm doing this as a live stream on a webcam hooked up to a different PC because I don't want to interfere with the benchmarks at all. So all of this testing is happening on that system. That's my 9800 X3D system. And then it's streaming from over here on an old 9900K system hooked up to a Logitech Brio. And like, if I were a professional streamer, which I'm not, this is Jared having fun because he's got to work way too much in the next couple of weeks. And I was like, hey, we should do a live stream. Oh, I crashed. Dang it. Dang it. I don't like when it crashes because then it takes you back out to this menu and you have to like go through extra screens. What I need is a zoom on this camera. Like, I just need to zoom in a few percent more. It's better if it's close though, right? Like, can you guys see that screen okay? Can you read it? I know the top right looks kind of blown out from the white balance, but you can see those numbers. I already did a 6650 XT review. It's live. So this is the thing. I reset all of my test benchmarks. I've got 22 games. My last suite, I think, had 18 or 19 games, but I ditched about half of those games and added new games. I'm trying to make it more relevant and up to date was the idea. And I switched test platforms from a 13900K to the 9800 X3D. And if you follow the news, you may have heard about the Raptor Lake chips failing problem. And that happened. That system over there, that was my Raptor Lake test bed. And in early 2024, my 13900K, like, it had always been a little bit flaky. I had to do some workarounds to get like Horizon Zero Dawn, the shader compilation at the start to run. And I finally figured out, like, oh, if I tweak the load line calibration, someone had suggested this and I tried it and it worked. And so like early 2024, I was finally able to get it running stable. And I was like, oh, finally, my 13900K isn't crashing anymore. I was so excited. And then over the next 2 months, maybe, everything was working, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. And I started having weird issues. And one of the weird issues was that NVIDIA drivers, when I installed them, and every time I swap GPUs, I run display driver uninstaller to clear out the cruft. And so if I'm testing a new game, you know, I'll basically test all the AMD GPUs and then switch to NVIDIA and test all the NVIDIA GPUs and then switch to Intel and test all the Intel GPUs. And usually when I collect all the data, then I start looking at it and I go, hey, wait a second. There's some screwed up numbers here. Like, why did the 4070 perform better than the 4070 Super at this setting? That shouldn't have happened. They should at best be tied. And so then I have to go back and retest. So like swapping drivers is a regular occasion for me. I probably do it not daily on my test beds, but multiple times per week for sure. And some days I might do it 5 or 6 times per day, depending on what you're doing. So with my 13900K, all of a sudden I started having problems where NVIDIA driver installation would just crash. Not crash with, like, it wouldn't drop to the desktop. It would just say, it had an error message like driver installation failed. And it wouldn't tell you anything more than that. And I was like, what is going on? And I tried tweaking all sorts of stuff. Oh, that's interesting. This is the OLED panel. Is that, what in the world? I can't control that. Okay, when this finishes, I'm going to tell it to execute the OLED panel protect. I'm worried about executing it in the middle of the benchmark run because it might screw things up. I'm pretty sure that's on the panel though. Like I can't click on that. Oh, it decided to do it for me. Nice. Real nice. So how long does that take? What the heck? I became a little bit less enamored with this OLED right now. Well, I hope the benchmark run completed okay. That was the second run at 4K. Yeah, that's pretty fun. That came up the other day. So I just got this monitor because I wanted a 240 hertz monitor with G-Sync and DisplayPort 2.1 for testing of the 5090 and lower cards. So I got this, and I think at about 4 hours of use, it popped up with a message, and I was able to click over and say delay, which I don't know if that was yesterday or 2 days ago. The days are blurring together. But the message just now seemed like there was no option for delaying. What are the buttons? It's just like a little round knob, but it's not doing anything. So OLED Protect on the MSI appears to mean shut the monitor off for minutes. Anyone have experience with that? Is this a usual thing with OLEDs? That's crazy to me. I thought it was going to be like some fast thing where it'd just be like shift some things around, maybe turn black for a bit, maybe like in my mind I was thinking, well, what if it could calculate over if it had some summing thing where it went like, hey, these are the pixel brightnesses that have been displayed on each pixel for the last 8 hours, and it could effectively play a reverse image of that to prevent burn-in. I was just thinking, like, I had no idea what it would do. This is not what I expected. Let's talk about the 5090 a little bit. So I can show this. Cards unplugged, that's allowed. 5090 Founders Edition. This is the new dongle, and you can see in the video how wobbly these are. These are individually stranded, and they're super flexible. So, you know, you can kink these at a pretty good angle without problems. And this connector for them is also angled so that when you plug it in, it comes out like that. Whereas the old ones on the 40 series was like this. The 30 series was also like this. I don't know why they shifted, because honestly, I think this angled connection feels like the smarter way to go. But maybe it was more robust. But if I pull out, let's see. Okay, so here's the 4090, and you'll notice that these are connected. I don't unplug those and plug them back in very often if I can avoid it, because it's a potential failure point. Like these 16-pin plugs, officially, I think they're only rated for 50 inserts, which I'm sure I've probably done the 4090 close to 50 times by now, but I try not to disconnect it and plug it back in. But look at, like, it's because of the way when it's plugged in that it rests, these have developed a permanent bend that direction. But they're all sheathed in these 4 individual packs that are far less flexible. And so, like, if you wanted to crank this like I did the other, you're going to put a lot more strain on this cable connector. And yeah, so the net result is they made these far more flexible on the 5090 Founders Edition, which I think is good. And because of the angled cable, like you see, this one comes straight out the top. It's less good. I don't like it as much. If you have this in a closed case, so someone was asking about testing the 5090 in a closed case. I could do that. I would need to put it in the case. And that's a pain, because it's, you know, it's like I've got my open test bed, and that's kind of required for the PCAP power. It's the power capture and an analytics tool. And it's why I have these open test beds. Some people are really worried about GPU temperatures and cooling. Hey, it's back. Yay. How long was that? That was like almost 5 minutes, right? Man, that's longer than I was expecting, MSI. Imagine that happening while you're in the middle of a gaming session. Raid boss. Oops, sorry. My display needed to reset. So the lesson of this is when it says, hey, we need to recalibrate or protect or whatever, maybe don't keep on clicking no. I only clicked no once as far as I recall, but still. Yeah, so the new cables are more flexible. I think that'll be good. And they're angled, so that'll be good as well. Net result is, combined with the 12-volt 2x6 connector standard rather than the original 12-volt high-power connections. Fingers crossed, double fingers crossed. Hopefully no melting 5090 cards. I mean, it's concerning to me that we're pulling up to 600 watts of power through a 16-pin connector. And I get the idea of making things more compact, because who wants 4 8-pin connectors on a card? But at the same time, I'm like, that is a lot of power through a relatively small connection. And in retrospect, I'm not surprised that the first generation of that had errors or issues and melted. Okay, we're done with Flight Simulator 2020. I'm going to sign off here, and probably we'll do Flight Simulator 2024, and then I'm going to sign off because I'm in Colorado and it's 5:30, and I need to go do other stuff for a little bit. I will be benchmarking until probably midnight, but I don't think you want me to leave the live stream running for 2 hours while I wander off. Some of you might. You could sit there and chat with my screen showing nothing. See, that's my timer saying, get out of your chair and go move around. I made a goal this year. Side note, I made a goal this year to walk 15,000 steps every day. And that's because I am 51 years old and not getting any younger. And I decided I needed to, there was a medical article that said sitting in a desk job, sitting at a desk all day is the new smoking. Like, it's as bad for you as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or some such. And as a 50-year-old, I feel that. And I'm like, yeah, I can see where that would be true. And so I've decided that I need to get out and go walk 15,000 steps a day, which is about 7.5 miles. And luckily it's warmed up today. Yesterday, the daytime high was 9 degrees and the nighttime low was minus 18 degrees. I think it's only like 25 degrees outside now. So that's tolerable. No, it says it's 34 degrees right now. See, I can totally go walking in the evening at 34 degrees. So I'm going to sign off after Flight Simulator 2024 and go on a walk, take my dog out. We'll pull you back while I load. I know there's only like 10 of you in here. Is this fun? I mean, it doesn't really hurt me to do this, other than talking constantly gets old. But this is basically what I have to do for the next 2 weeks is swap cards and run benchmarks. And at some point, maybe do this with a partner 5090 card. Because I've already tested the 5090 Founders Edition. Don't need to retest that. But if I have an Asus or MSI or somebody else 5090 that I need to test, I would be able to throw that in and do live benchmarking of that. We're coming up on 3 hours. You guys would watch it. Would other people watch it? Is it even beneficial? I don't know. I've said a lot of stuff in the past 3 hours. Someone should like bookmark the good things that I said and be like, oh, you know what? At 45 minutes in, he talked about this thing and that was cool. Or everyone could just say, shut up, Jared. We're tired of your rambling. No one's asking me too many questions though. Yeah, 150 push-ups in the morning. That's more than I can do. See, I do that. I exercise between runs normally. I haven't been doing it on video, but I'll stand up and march in place just to get some movement. Let's see. What's going on here? All right. Last test. Flight Simulator 2024. As usual, I start at medium. We are not doing upscaling or frame generation. I will try and test frame generation at some point, but it's like there's multi-frame generation things that are enabled in beta branches, and so not only like you have to run extra tests, but you also have to install a beta branch, which usually means you overwrite your regular branch, and then when you shift back to a card that's not a 50 series card, you have to undo the beta branch. And that adds a lot to the testing time. And so if I'm trying to get 10 GPUs tested and all of a sudden I'm like doing an extra 2 days of messing around with DLSS frame generation, multi-frame generation, and I can't even run that on AMD cards, and upscaling, DLSS upscaling is not the same as FSR upscaling, is not the same as XeSS upscaling. They're different algorithms. They look different. This is interesting. I don't know if you can see this in the video as well, but these numbers on the first run of Flight Simulator 2024, they're really choppy. They don't update like smoothly. So I let it run for a minute to kind of warm up, maybe get a few of those hitches like you just saw go out, and then I restart it. But on the restarts, it's a lot smoother on those dials and stuff. So same test sequence as 2024, but this time I can't hit the space bar at the same times. Oh no, I did my increased throttle too soon. I want to end at 30 TRQ over here. I don't know what that means. I'm not a flight pilot person. Yeah, this is a bad run. See, normally I should be passing over that, so it's not in keeping with my normal testing. But see, this is a lot smoother now. This is a lot smoother now. The first run, it's like they're only updating every 4 frames or something. It's kind of weird. Okay, let's try that again. So I wait. It shifts to the landing thing usually. And I start there. Immediately hit left. Hit 5 to pause the rotation there. Start frame time capture. Hit F1 to drop to 0 speed on the engine, and then hit up 9 times, and it will eventually balance out at 30. And I want the plane to pass roughly over, like the center of the plane should pass roughly over this white landing strip marker. So this is my pseudo-CAN benchmark for 2024. Flight Simulator 2024. So the long-term idea, not idea, the long-term goal is I test all of the graphics cards that I can on the new test suite where it makes sense. Obviously, ray tracing games you can't run on non-ray tracing cards, and you can't run, like, even if you have ray tracing, like an RTX 2060 as an example, that is not going to handle Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K Ultra, RT Ultra settings. It's not even going to come close. Same thing with like a 6600, an RX 6600. It's not really intended for 4K ray tracing. So I'm trying to determine how far down I go. I did do 4K ray tracing tests on the B580 and B570 just for completeness. And it was actually interesting because there were games where the B580, like, it wasn't playable necessarily, but it might do like 15 or 20 frames per second. And then the B570 ran out of memory, even though it was only 2 gigabytes less. So it had 10 gigabytes instead of 12 gigabytes. And so I think, was it Cyberpunk? Cyberpunk may have been one of those. And the net result was, instead of like 20 frames per second, it got like 3. It was just a slideshow. And other cards, when you start running out of memory, depending on the game, they get very, they can start having massive run-to-run variance. Stalker 2 is another game that at the epic settings, it needs more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM for sure. And so, like, the first run of Stalker 2 on, I think, like the 4060 was actually okay, or it started out okay. Like, it was running, maybe it's getting 30 frames or 20 frames per second, whatever it was. And then halfway through the run, all of a sudden performance just bombs, and it starts fluctuating between like 10 frames per second and 0 frames per second, and stuttering, and it becomes unplayable. And so it's like, well, what do you even show if you benchmark that? And can it be fixed with game updates or driver updates, and what's going on? And it's not really clear. But my goal is to test, at least going back 8 or so years, all the graphics cards that have launched, and test them at 1080p, medium, and hopefully ultra. I'm sure some of the cards won't do ultra, like they'll just refuse because they don't have enough VRAM. Others might crash. We'll see. The 6 gigabyte cards are going to be problematic for the 1080p ultra testing, just because lack of VRAM. So that means your 5600 XT, 2060, 1660 Ti Super, regular 1660, like all of those are going to be very iffy at 1080p Ultra. And so I won't test cards like that at 1440p with the modern suite of games that I'm using. It's not worth the hassle, because games don't work and the numbers become meaningless. But I want at least 1080p medium, if not 1080p medium and 1080p Ultra on all the rasterization tests for all the cards that I can get running. 4 gigabyte cards are definitely out. Like I think I have 7 or 8 games at least that they might not need an 8 gigabyte card, but they definitely need more than a 4 gigabyte card. So, have to see where that goes. But I'll start testing or retesting everything with the latest cards at the top. So for art reviews, I did do some of the mainstream budget cards. So like the 4060 and the 60 or 7600. I actually did the 6600 as well, but I haven't done like the 6600 XT, 6650 XT, 6700 XT, 4060 Ti. Like there's a whole bunch that I haven't done. But so for the 5090, 5080, I'm now going up to the very top. I'll test everything down until I've tested all the 50 series, 40 series, and 7000 series, and ARC where I haven't already tested that. And then I'll do like the next step down. So then I'll start doing the 3000 series, the RTX 30 series, and the RX 6000 series. When that's done, I'll do the RTX 20 series, and then just for rasterization only, we'll have like the RX 5000 series and the GTX 10 series, and maybe Vega and Polaris. We'll see if those even run. I think driver updates have officially stopped for those, but they do kind of, I have seen a few drivers where it's like, oh, there was a security patch, or maybe it's quarterly updates or something instead of the more regular monthly or a couple times a month updates that you get on the newer cards. But all of the testing for the GPU hierarchy will take literally months to complete. And then by the time it's all done, you're like, wait, drivers have changed, games have been patched. Are the numbers even meaningful? Are the numbers meaningful? And the answer is maybe. Maybe they're meaningful. It's a constant treadmill of benchmarking and re-benchmarking. And also swapping out games on occasion. Like I will drop Flight Simulator 2020 from testing at some point, I think. It's 2024 is a little too new, so I was like, well, maybe I'll keep 2020 around for a little bit. Cyberpunk, it's kind of feeling old now, but at the same time, it was such a big name, and there's still a lot of people that play it, and it's got all these ray tracing things, so I've kind of kept using it, even though it's one of the oldest games in my updated suite. Minecraft RTX stuff, ray tracing stuff, that's in the same category. It's been around for a while now. Minecraft itself is, 15 years old or something. So I try to do a mix of old and new as best as I'm able. Farser Pent asks, how much does 8 lanes versus 16 lanes matter? And the answer is it depends on a lot of factors, like what you're doing and the game. So mostly these days, when you're talking about PCI Express bandwidth, what's being utilized on the bandwidth side is sending updates from the CPU to the GPU, draw calls and such, which don't contain like everything. So all the textures kind of get loaded into graphics card memory. A lot of the world geometry gets loaded, but then some of that geometry can change. And so you're sending over geometry updates, and basically my experience with it is that in general, 8 lanes versus 16 lanes on PCI Express 4.0
doesn't really matter that much unless you're at the very top end of the stack, which is why cards like the 4060, 4060 Ti, 7600, 7600 XT, those all have 8 lanes instead of 16, right? 5090 obviously has 16 lanes of PCIe 5, so twice the bandwidth per lane means that an X8 connection on a by 8 lane connection on a 5090 is equivalent to a 16 lane connection on a PCIe 4.0. I said that wrong. 8 PCIe 5.0 lanes is equivalent in connectivity speed to 16 PCIe 4.0 lanes. And the funny thing is, do we have any PCIe 4.0 platforms? I'm trying to think, like, when did we shift? So I think maybe like Rocket Lake and Comet Lake, so 10th and 11th gen Intel, were PCIe 4.0. Is that right? And maybe the Zen 3 series, or was it Zen 2, was also PCIe 4.0. But everything Alder Lake and beyond and Zen 4 and beyond is all PCIe 5.0. But we haven't had any PCIe 5.0 cards yet. We've only had SSDs. Where am I in my testing? I don't know. We'll redo 1440p one more time just in case. So I think 5090, you're going to end up CPU bottlenecked in a variety of situations at like lower resolutions and lower detail settings, which is why people who are buying one are people buying a 5090. They're not planning on running 1080p medium, but I test it just because it's part of the hierarchy and it's kind of fun to have those numbers. In general, I did test ARC B580 on PCIe 3.0 instead of 4.0. So that's having the bandwidth as well. And I think that caused maybe it depended on the game. Some games I think saw over a 10% drop, but most of them were like 3 to 5% slower. And that's with a slower GPU. So if you bump up to 16 lanes and a faster GPU, I think the bottom line is you wouldn't want to run a 5090 on anything except PCIe 4.0 16 lanes as a minimum. But in order to get 4.0 with 16 lanes, you're looking at, well, basically, let me start over. If you're looking at a 5090, you probably want either a 9800X 3D or maybe a 1414900K from Intel. You could do the new Core 9 Ultra 285K. I have to think about the new names. But the 285K in general is slower than the 14900K. I think it's probably on par with the 13900K, where it wins some games and loses others. And if you've got any of those CPUs that I just named, they're all PCIe 5.0. Like, I would not recommend anyone go out and buy an integrated graphics type chip what's the top integrated solution? I know there was 5700G from the Zen 3 era, but is there like a 6700G or 77? I don't think so. But if you had like a chip with faster integrated graphics, right? But it only had 8 lanes of PCIe, I think your big problem there, it's not going to be the 8 lanes of PCIe Express linkage. It's going to be more the fact that these chips that have faster integrated graphics usually have slower CPUs. And so the slower CPU combined with the slower PCI Express lanes ends up being this double whammy. And it's like, yeah, you don't put a $2,000 graphics card with a $200 CPU and expect top performance. That's my feeling. It's kind of like the people, someone was maybe it wasn't on here. Someone was talking about like power supplies and whether they might need a new power supply for the 5090. And they have a nice Seasonic 80 plus titanium power supply, but it's only 850 watts. And so technically 575 watts from the GPU, say 125 watts from your CPU, that's 700 watts. Everything else is maybe only 50 to 75 watts combined. So technically that's still below 850 watts and it should run. And if you power limit the 5090 to say 80% so that it's staying below 450 watts, then I'm sure it will be fine, as long as the PSU is still delivering proper power, because PSUs do get old. Like your brand new 1500 watt 80 plus titanium, in 5 years it's not going to have the same performance characteristics as when it was brand new. It will probably be a little bit less efficient, run a little bit hotter. Peak power might drop from 1500 watts to like, hey, you really shouldn't try to pull more than 1200 watts. Okay, last benchmark. Any final comments? Hope you guys had a little bit of entertainment listening to me ramble. I know it's been very unstructured. I'm talking to myself is what it feels like. But I do have a wealth of knowledge about GPUs, and so I can spout off and ramble for a long time. My wife will attest to that. And the microphone is not great on this. It's just the Logitech Brio microphone, because I didn't want to try and set up a nicer microphone, and I didn't want to try and get a nicer webcam setup because I got to do the benchmarks. So this is really just about me doing benchmarks and getting some feedback from you guys, rather than making the world's greatest live stream of benchmarking. And I will be doing this a lot in the coming days. So that's it. Thanks for watching. I'm going to reset this and save and exit and go check chat before I sign off. There's the Flight Simulator 2024 numbers. If you can't read them, getting about 52 frames per second at 4K, 80 frames per second at 1440p, which I ran 4 times. That's more than I normally do. 98 frames per second at 1080p. And then 172 frames per second at 1080p medium. How's that compared to a 4090? I don't know. Off the top of my head, I couldn't even tell you. I'd have to go and look up the numbers. Did I say 4090 or 5090? I don't even know. That's it. We'll come over here to chat. You guys can see yourselves. So transformer upscaling, the DLSS upscaling. It's not clear to me when that's coming out. They've said they're working on it. At one point, I'm pretty sure someone said it's coming first to the RTX 50 series. And I don't know if that means, like, are they training it to use FP4 where it's available? And then, like, on the 40 series, it would use FP8. But the current DLSS upscaling using the CNN, the convolutional neural network, as far as I know, that's using FP16 for everything. And it runs on everything from a laptop 2050 up to a desktop 4090 and the future 5090, right? But it's all done in FP16 mode. So to me, that seems like if they can make this work with FP8, they could do it faster on a 40 series. And if they can make it work with FP4, they can do it even faster again on a 50 series. And so maybe they start the training for a 50 series GPU with FP4 quantization, and then they have to
maybe tweak things and optimize it to make it work okay with FP8 on a 40 series. And then they have to further tweak it to make it work with FP16 on a 30 series and 20 series. I don't know. Let's see what else. Yeah, cyberpunk path tracing. So my initial review, my plan, you guys, for the reviews, depending on what I can get done, is I might have to post a review in progress because there's so much testing to get done. And I want to do the baseline like you're seeing in this video of me testing RTX and RX cards at native resolution without upscaling in frame gen. And then I need to go back and be like, okay, what else can I do? Because I do want to look at full path tracing in the games that support it, which there's not that many. So you got Cyberpunk, you've got Alan Wake 2. I mean, obviously, like there is stuff like Minecraft that I already test, but it's so much less complex of a game that the performance there is very different than like in Alan Wake 2. There's also Indiana Jones and the Great Circle supports full ray tracing. Black Myth Wukong has it. I'm trying to think what else. I feel like there's maybe 6 or 7 games that have full path tracing now. But yeah, it's something to look at, because I think on the 5090 for sure, like if you've got a 5090, you can probably actually do full path tracing with DLSS transformers, maybe with frame generation, and still end up with a very good looking result that feels good as well. I'm still less convinced about multi-frame generation. I still have to see how that feels in practice, because the only thing that NVIDIA showed us at CES where we were hands-on using it was like, it was a multi-frame generation in Valorant or something like that, where the frame rates were stupidly high. And so it's like, well, yeah, if you're running at 300 frames per second, divide that by 4, you're still getting 75 frames per second input, and that's going to feel fine. But if you're doing 4K path tracing in Alan Wake 2 with quality mode upscaling using DLSS transformers, which are more demanding than DLSS CNN, like what's the resulting frame rate? Maybe it's only 50. And then if you take frame generation, so on a 40 series, you might go from 50 to 75. On the 50 series, what do? Do you go from 50 to 120, 150? I mean, if you went to 150, double the frame gen performance with multi-frame gen, I think it would still be fine. But if you only get a 50% increase, then your input speed actually got lower. And so if you're getting 120 FPS with multi-frame generation, I don't think that's going to feel that good. I know I've experienced that with frame generation, where if you're on like a 4080 or 4070 and you're getting 60 frames per second with frame gen, your user input is actually happening at 30 frames per second, and it starts to feel laggy. I think you need to be above 80 with frame generation so that your base frame rate is at least 40 frames per second. So with multi-frame generation, if it's that same level, then you would need to be above 160 with multi-frame generation. And probably the 5090 gets there even in complex games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong. The 5070, like when they said the 5070 is as fast as the 4090, I'm not sure anyone who knows anything about graphics cards believes that for an instant. Like it's ludicrous. That's it. That's my final thoughts for the day. Thanks for watching. 3 hours and 25 minutes of benchmarking, and we got through 8 games, I think. So not halfway done. We'll see you next time. Bye.